Good morning. I'm Maureen Hand, staff in the Industrial Strategies Division. Welcome to another workshop in the 2022 Scoping Plan Update Series. My colleagues Jordan Ramalingam and Stephanie Kato will be joining me for this presentation. This workshop is an opportunity for stakeholders to provide input on the draft scenarios and modeling assumptions related to future energy and technology options to help define paths to achieve carbon neutrality. In addition to today's presentation, a document summarizing all of the modeling assumptions can be found under the Public Workshops link on the CARB Scoping Plan webpage. This workshop is being recorded, and we will post the recording on the webpage. Next slide, please. Today, we will present draft carbon neutral scenario assumptions, and we will share 4 alternatives. These scenarios reflect existing statute, the governor's direction, and state agency plans. These scenarios also reflect feedback received from stakeholders from our previous workshops. We are providing the public with an opportunity to comment on these scenarios and modeling assumptions before we commence modeling. And note that at this time, these scenarios are for evaluation purposes and are not meant to inform any current regulatory activities at CARB. This is an iterative process, and this is not the only chance to inform scenario assumptions for modeling as we work towards a final scoping plan draft for next year. Next slide, please. The number of audience members at virtual scoping plan workshops has ranged from 400 to 800. It's presented a challenge for maximizing the number of stakeholders that are able to provide oral comments. To address these concerns, we want to be transparent on how we will be managing public comments during the workshops. We will remind commenters to unmute themselves to speak. We will have time allotted to the EJ Advisory Committee members to provide comments after presentations. We will try to announce how many hands are raised periodically during the comment period. There will be no ceding of time to another commenter. We do recommend that EJ Advisory Committee members use the time after the presentations rather than waiting for the general comment period. And please do not email staff directly to ask that you be unmuted. Next slide. Following the staff presentation, the EJ Advisory Committee members will be invited to provide comments and ask questions, and then we will invite the other attendees. To ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function in the GoToWebinar toolbar, which should be located to the right of your screen. When staff calls your name, please unmute yourself by clicking the red button and proceed to introduce yourself. The red arrow at the top of the toolbar will expand the control panel for additional options. You can also provide written feedback or recommendations to us through the link on the Scoping Plan Meetings and Workshops page. Next slide, please. To accommodate the significant interest from stakeholders and to provide additional time for the EJ Advisory Committee to provide input at this stage, we have adjusted the modeling schedule. Today, we will share draft scenario assumptions. A public comment docket is open until October 22nd for you to provide feedback on the scenarios. We will then revise the scenarios and assumptions based on that feedback we receive, and we will present those revised scenarios at a workshop in late October. We will take additional feedback during that workshop. At the beginning of November, we will provide the resulting draft scenarios and modeling assumptions to the contractors to conduct the modeling. It will take multiple months to obtain the full set of results, including emissions, health impacts, and economic impacts of these scenarios. Next slide. Okay, I'm sure you've seen this before, but we have been including this in all of our workshops to remind us of the need to redefine our scope of sources and sinks in the framework of carbon neutrality. Simply put, carbon neutrality is achieved when emission sources equal sinks. Until now, every scoping plan has focused on reducing the emissions from the sources defined in the AB 32 inventory, which focuses on fossil energy and industrial sources. We do have a separate inventory for our natural and working lands. The framework of carbon neutrality expands the scope to include all sources, which means the emissions from the natural and working lands and all sinks. The sinks can be natural and working lands, or carbon capture and sequestration for large emitters, or direct air capture and permanent storage of CO2 from the atmosphere. Today's workshop, however, focuses on approaches to reduce emissions from the sources in the AB32 inventory. Here is an overview of the modeling approach to support the scoping plan. We will assess progress towards the 2030 target. We are developing carbon neutral scenarios for 2035 and 2045. These scenarios reflect different pathways to transition our energy needs away from fossil fuels. Today, we are presenting initial scenarios and modeling input assumptions that will be used in the E3 pathways model. The end-use outcomes from these scenarios help us understand the pace of transition and the quantity of greenhouse gases we can eliminate from the energy sector over the next decade. And if there are still any remaining greenhouse gas emissions, we will need to quantify and determine how to compensate for those to achieve carbon neutrality. Separate efforts are underway to estimate the sequestration potential of our natural and working lands, and these efforts will be discussed in future workshops. We will quantify the air quality, health, and economic impacts of each scenario. These results will be included in the draft scoping plan. Based on these evaluations of different scenarios, we will identify a single scoping plan scenario. Next slide. Beginning with the June kickoff workshops, we have held 9 workshops. We have received comments from a wide range of stakeholders, many of which are represented on this slide. We have heard from environmental justice organizations, industry trade groups, and individuals. We've incorporated as many of the comments as possible in these scenarios and modeling assumptions that we are presenting today. We can benefit from the great deal of work that has been done previously to understand the various options available for decarbonization. Almost all decarbonization pathways include reducing combustion of fossil fuels in every sector to the maximum extent possible, and producing nearly all of our electricity with clean energy resources. Some industries will be hard to electrify, like aviation and industrial heat sources, and we will need alternative low carbon fuels to meet those energy needs. And those might include things like liquid biofuels, renewable natural gas, hydrogen, and others. We have developed 4 scenarios that incorporate these approaches to decarbonization. These scenarios emphasize technology-based outcomes that we need to achieve by mid-century. They identify the alternative energy sources that we need to ensure are available by mid-century to meet our energy demand. While many of the modeling input assumptions are presented as endpoints in a future year, the pathways model creates a transition from today's energy sources to the specified endpoint. So here are the 4 draft scenarios. 2 of them achieve carbon neutrality in 2035 and 2 by 2045. Alternative 1 phases out combustion completely. This alternative also does not include any engineered carbon removal, either at the source or directly from the atmosphere. Alternative 2 implements a full suite of technology options, including engineered carbon removal at a rapid pace in order to reduce emissions as much as possible by 2035. Alternative 3 uses a broad portfolio of existing and emerging fossil fuel alternatives and includes achievement of Executive Order N7920, eliminating internal combustion engines throughout the transportation sector as much as possible. Alternative 4 relies on existing and some emerging technologies in line with recent agency reports. The next 2 slides provide high-level details for each of these 4 alternatives. Next slide, thank you. Alternatives 1 and 2 are designed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2035, and therefore they also aim to exceed the 2030 greenhouse gas emission target of 40% below 1990 levels by 2030. Alternative 1 phases out combustion of any fossil fuel or alternative fuel by 2035. As a result, hard to decarbonize sectors like cement and aviation without non-combustion alternatives available would be phased out of California. We may need to import goods, which just exports emissions. In contrast, alternative 2 utilizes all current and emerging fuels, but focuses on reducing fossil fuel combustion. A broad portfolio of zero carbon technologies would allow hard to decarbonize sectors to continue operations in California. Alternative 1 requires early retirement through buyback programs of vehicles, gas appliances, and industrial equipment to phase out combustion by 2035. After eliminating combustion of all fuel in 2035, non-combustion emissions like methane and hydrofluorocarbons will remain. Without a path to reduce these emissions, carbon neutrality may not be achieved. Alternative 2 emphasizes transportation emission reduction by transitioning to zero-emission vehicles rapidly. This reduction in demand corresponds to reduction in petroleum supply as well. The transition of vehicles, gas appliances, and industrial equipment to fossil fuel alternatives will not be complete in 2035. These remaining emissions will need to be removed from the atmosphere in order to reach carbon neutrality by 2035. Okay, next slide. These two scenarios, alternatives 3 and 4, are designed to achieve carbon neutrality by 2045. Again, a broad portfolio of zero carbon technologies is utilized in these scenarios. Alternative 3 implements fossil fuel alternatives aggressively, exceeding the 80% below 1990 emission levels by 2050, while alternative 4 generally remains on the path to 80% by 2050. Alternative 3 emphasizes transportation sector emission reductions based on the executive order, and it forces all fleets to zero carbon by 2045. Both alternatives rely on carbon dioxide removal to compensate for remaining fossil fuel non-combustion emissions. The quantity of CDR required will be lower in alternative 3 due to the greater emphasis on reducing fossil fuel use. As I mentioned earlier, we request your feedback by October 22nd. Please let us know if we should consider different scenarios or if there are specific modeling inputs that you would change in a given scenario. Please provide sufficient background on technologies or fuel options that you think should be included in the scoping plan. And please include public health or cost information if that's available. So now we're going to share some of the detailed modeling assumptions by sector. Again, there is a summary table posted to the Scoping Plan Public Workshops webpage that lists all of the modeling assumptions for your reference. Next slide. Many stakeholders commented on the importance of reducing methane emissions because that can have an immediate impact on climate change. The short-lived climate pollutant workshop held on September 8th provided an overview of the progress and challenges associated with reducing non-combustion methane emissions in California. The SB 1383 target for methane emission reductions is 40% below 2013 levels by 2030. Methane emissions originate from 3 primary sources: dairy and livestock, organic waste from landfills and wastewater treatment, and oil and gas extraction and distribution infrastructure leaks. There are 2 primary strategies to reduce methane associated with dairies and organic waste. It can be captured, treated, and used for energy as renewable natural gas, or the source materials can be converted into soil amendments, avoiding release into the atmosphere. Oil and gas extraction and distribution leaks can be reduced as part of extraction operations through abatement programs and regulatory action, and these emissions will diminish as demand for natural gas goes down and facilities are retired. So these strategies are represented to different degrees in the 4 alternative scenarios. Alternative 1 excludes combustion of any fuel for energy production. In this scenario, methane captured from landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and dairy digesters remains at today's level. That biogas is used to produce hydrogen in fuel cells for electricity production. Efforts to reduce methane emissions from dairy and livestock operations are limited to alternative manure management practices. We also assume commercial availability of options for enteric emission reductions deployed before 2030. Organic waste diversion accelerates, such that the 75% disposal reduction target of SB 1383 is achieved, and oil and gas methane emissions will be reduced as fossil fuel combustion is phased out in 2035. Alternatives 2, 3, and 4 then take advantage of all the methane reduction options, including some emerging technologies. The pace and extent of implementation varies. In these scenarios, methane emissions from landfills, wastewater treatment plants, and dairies are captured, and the renewable natural gas is used to produce energy. Alternative 2 reflects rapid expansion of the dairy digester methane capture, consistent with aiming for carbon neutrality by 2035. We also assume some additional deployment of technological and mitigation options at landfills to further increase methane capture and reduce emissions. Alternatives 3 and 4 also increase landfill and dairy digester methane capture, but at a more moderate pace. Alternative manure management is deployed for smaller dairies in alternatives 2, 3, and 4, along with enteric strategies. The pace of organic waste diversion varies across these 3 alternatives, and fugitive emissions from oil and gas operations are reduced by 2030 through a mix of continued implementation of abatement programs and regulations. Again, the emissions are further reduced through the retirement of gas system components, which coincides with falling demand for natural gas. Okay, next slide. California is home to manufacturing, construction, and agricultural industries. The modeling assumption summary table lists industries according to the AB 32 GHG inventory. And you can see 2 examples on this slide. California industries rely primarily on natural gas, but they also rely on electricity and diesel. Many of these industries require energy in the form of heat, for example, cement production and food processing. As we think about decarbonizing our industry, we need to consider fossil fuel alternatives that meet the required energy needs for these industries. We also need to consider SB 596, which Governor Newsom signed into law last week. In this law, CARB will develop a comprehensive strategy for the state's cement sector to achieve net zero emissions of greenhouse gases by no later than 2045. All 4 of the draft scenarios rely heavily on electricity. They differ in the pace of transition and in the extent to which electricity can meet the unique industrial demands. Energy efficiency improvements that reduce the energy needed while maintaining the same level of production are assumed in all 4 scenarios. Alternative 1 phases out combustion by 2035. In this scenario, industrial processes are transitioned to electricity rapidly, reaching 100% of energy demand in several industrial sectors. Construction and agricultural energy demand that relies on diesel fuel is also electrified. We assume that boilers and process heat requirements in industries such as pulp and paper can be electrified, and the very high heat requirements for industries such as cement cannot be met by electrification. With no other suitable non-combustion alternative, these industries leave California, or if they stay, we do not achieve carbon neutrality. Alternatives 2, 3, and 4 expand the decarbonization options available to industry. In these scenarios, the available supply of renewable natural gas is blended into the pipeline. Hydrogen is also blended into the natural gas pipeline, reducing the GHG emissions associated with combustion of pipeline gas in general. Dedicated hydrogen pipelines that link industrial facilities in geographic clusters are generally believed to be a more cost-effective alternative than electrification for some industrial applications. Carbon capture and storage is implemented, particularly on large facilities that require very high temperatures and emit greenhouse gases in the production of cement, for example. The differences between alternatives 2, 3, and 4 are defined by the pace of transition and the extent to which alternatives are adopted. Alternative 2 accelerates electrification, introduction of dedicated hydrogen pipelines, and implementation of CCS on large facilities, aiming for carbon neutrality by 2035, while Alternative 3 achieves roughly the same level of transition away from fossil fuel, but at a slower pace. Alternative 4 relies to a lesser extent on the available decarbonization options. In each of these scenarios, remaining energy demand would be met with pipeline gas, biofuels, and/or liquid or fossil fuels. Okay, now we're going to transition to the transportation sector, and I'm going to hand it off to my colleague, Jordan Ramalingam.
Thanks, Maureen. Good morning, everyone. So I'll start with vehicle miles traveled, or VMT. Reducing energy demand for transportation is critical for achieving our climate and air quality goals. And this is a complex issue at the nexus of land use planning, affordability, access to safe and reliable low carbon mobility options, and more, and is predominantly managed at the local level. Reducing VMT is important from an emissions standpoint because reducing vehicle trips cuts down on fuel consumed, so there are fewer emissions from vehicle tailpipes. As California's population continues to grow, the focus will be on reducing VMT per person or per capita. So alternative 1 achieves the highest VMT reductions, 15% below 2019 levels by 2030, and 20% below 2019 levels by 2035. Alternatives 2 and 3 are aligned, achieving 12% VMT per capita reductions in 2030 and 22% by 2045 from a 2019 baseline, but diverge on the reductions achieved by the respective carbon neutrality date. Alternative 4 assumes the fewest reductions and achieves 10% by 2030 and 15% by 2045 relative to 2019. Next slide, please. Okay. Governor Newsom's Executive Order N7920 established aggressive goals to transition to zero emission vehicles, or ZEVs, wherever possible. And by ZEVs, we mean battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell electric technologies. The speed at which ZEVs are adopted will directly affect California's ability to achieve our climate and air quality goals, and it's a critical modeling input. This slide focuses on on-road vehicles, including passenger vehicles and medium or heavy-duty trucks and buses. We've included more proposed scenario inputs for several off-road equipment types in the scenario inputs handout that's posted on the website Maureen referred to, if you're interested in following up on that. All of these scenarios are aggressive, and this reflects the scope of the transition to clean technologies. In Alt 1, 100% of new light-duty vehicle sales are ZEVs by 2025. Consistent with the intention to phase out combustion by 2035, the scenario assumes that only pure ZEVs are on the road by 2035. This scenario also assumes 100% of truck sales are ZEV, again, meaning battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell electric, by 2030. And only ZEVs remain on the road by 2035. These assumptions necessitate a mechanism to remove internal combustion engine vehicles from the road, such as a buyback program. Alternative 2 assumes 100% of new light-duty vehicle sales are ZEVs by 2030. However, this scenario allows for combustion of fuels, so a buyback program is not needed to convert the entire fleet by 2035. For trucks, this scenario also assumes 100% ZEV sales by 2030 and that only ZEVs remain on the road by 2045. Alt 3 is modeled after the Executive Order N7920 and achieves 100% ZEV sales by 2035. Truck sales would similarly reach 100% ZEV sales by 2035. Now, this does not result in full fleet turnover by 2045, so some liquid fuel demand would remain. And finally, Alt 4 is modeled after the ITS AV74 carbon neutrality study. And that scenario achieves 100% ZEV sales for all vehicle classes by 2040, and therefore leaves the highest number of internal combustion engine vehicles on the road in the target carbon neutrality year of 2045. So for all of these scenarios, we're also assuming that transit buses achieve 100% zero emission sales by 2030, in line with the already adopted innovative clean transit rule. Now, although the state is signaling a rapid transition to battery electric and hydrogen fuel cell vehicles, biofuels will still play a significant role in decarbonizing the transportation sector, both in the short term during this transition period and potentially in the long run in equipment that depends on combustion. Alternative 1 assumes no biofuel combustion by 2035, consistent with the assumption that only battery electric or hydrogen fuel cell electric on-road vehicles remain in operation by that year. This scenario also assumes that half of the aviation fuel demand is met by hydrogen fuel cells in 2035. And because the scenario assumes no combustion, the other half of aviation energy demand would not be met. By contrast, alternatives 2 through 4 assume that available feedstocks are used to produce both conventional and advanced biofuels, as well as hydrogen for transportation. Conventional biofuels include the alternative fuels currently utilized in the California Transportation Fuel Pool, like renewable diesel, biodiesel, ethanol, and others. And these would likely utilize raw material feedstocks like energy crops or vegetable oils, residues and waste oils, and biogas captured from landfills, dairies, or wastewater facilities. Advanced biofuels could include liquid fuels produced by technologies such as pyrolysis of woody biomass, such as ag residue, forest clearings, and more. The scenarios would assume a transition over time from conventional to advanced biofuels. The degree to which biofuels are relied on to decarbonize the fuel pool in alternatives 2 through 4 likely scales with the rate of zero emission vehicle adoption. Alternatives 2 through 4 also assume varying levels of zero emission technology penetration in aviation. It is implied that sustainable aviation fuel would play a part in decarbonizing the remaining liquid aviation fuel demand in those 3 scenarios. Today, nearly all of the oil refined in California is used to supply vehicles in California. In 2019, oil extracted in California made up just under 30% of the fuel that is refined in California to supply cars, trucks, trains, and airplanes. The other 70% of oil refined in California is imported. The governor recently instructed CARB to evaluate phase out of oil extraction by 2045, as well as more recent direction in a letter to CARB's chair to reduce supply and demand for petroleum by 2035. As such, we are considering options to phase out oil extraction in California by 2035 or by 2045. We're also considering an option where oil extraction declines relative to the demand for refined petroleum. Similarly, we are considering options that reduce the amount of fuel refined in California. So you'll remember that Alt 1 phases out combustion by 2035, so consistent with that assumption, Alternative 1 assumes that oil and gas extraction and refining are phased out by 2035. Alternative 2 also phases out oil extraction by 2035, but does not have a hard constraint on fuel demand. Petroleum refining operations therefore ramp down in tandem with petroleum demand in state. Remaining petroleum demand in 2035 would be met by imported crude oil once the in-state production is phased out in that scenario. Alternative 3 utilizes a 2045 carbon neutrality date and assumes phase out of extraction operations in 2045. This scenario also assumes that petroleum refining operations ramp down in tandem with demand, with potential for imports of crude oil to California refineries to cover remaining petroleum demand in 2045. And Alt 4 takes a more gradual approach and does not establish an end date for extraction or refining, instead assuming that both oil extraction and refining ramp down in tandem with demand for petroleum. Alternatives 2 through 4 all assume that carbon capture and sequestration is applied to refineries by 2030 to capture emissions from remaining operations. With that, I'll hand it over to my colleague Stephanie Cotto to continue the presentation.
Thanks, Jordan. In 2018, CARB adopted a 2030 electricity sector greenhouse gas planning target range of 30 to 53 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, using the 2017 scoping plan to inform utility greenhouse gas planning targets pursuant to SB 350. SB 350 had also extended California's renewable electricity procurement goal to 50% by 2030, and then this goal was made more stringent by SB 100, increasing the 2030 target to 60% renewables and also requiring California to provide 100% of its retail sales of electricity from renewable and zero carbon resources by 2045. Since the early 2000s, the deployment of renewable and less carbon-intensive resources have facilitated the continuing decline in fossil fuel electricity generation. The electricity sector is going to play a pivotal role in any decarbonization scenario. The sector needs to substantially reduce emissions while demand rises as other sectors like transportation and buildings look to electrification to migrate from fossil fuels to reduce their own emissions. This aggressive transition towards electricity will require increased electricity generation and storage capacity. The 2021 SB 100 Joint Agency Report initial analysis concludes SB 100 is technically feasible through multiple pathways, though further analysis is needed to verify that results satisfy grid reliability requirements. To reach the 2045 target, California will need to roughly triple its current capacity. And the analysis shows that diversity in energy resources and technologies lowers overall costs, and retaining some natural gas power capacity may minimize costs while ensuring uninterrupted power during the transition to 100% clean energy. Increased energy storage and advancements in zero carbon technologies can reduce natural gas capacity needs. Additional scenarios were also studied that excluded electricity generated from combustion of biomass and natural gas, as well as accelerating the 100% target. Preliminary results indicate these targets may be achievable but may increase overall costs. Considering this context and stakeholder feedback, I'll review the proposed assumptions. So first, consistent with SB 350, we list the sector greenhouse gas target for each scenario. The general basis for alternative 1 is the SB 100 no combustion scenario, which excludes combustion-based generation regardless of fuel. Consistent with the intention to phase out combustion and meet quicker carbon neutrality timing of 2035, the sector targets of 23 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2030 and 0 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2035 are the most stringent of the 4. This scenario would also cover total load versus just retail sales. Outside of the combustion restriction, other RPS eligible and zero carbon resources would be available, and hydrogen fuel cells would provide firm capacity. Alternative 2 has the same sector greenhouse gas target in 2035 and also covers total load, but assumes a 2030 sector target of 30 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. This scenario employs broad resources that are RPS eligible and zero carbon. You can also refer to attachment B of the proposed pathway scenario modeling assumptions document that's part of the workshop materials, which lists the proposed generation technologies to include in the modeling. But these resources include solar PV, solar thermal, onshore wind, offshore wind, geothermal, bioenergy, fuel cells using green hydrogen, small and large hydroelectric power, nuclear, drop-in renewable fuels such as biomethane and green hydrogen, and natural gas generation with carbon capture and sequestration. Alternative 3 is similar to alternative 2, but with a 2045 carbon neutrality timeline and covers total load and includes the same eligible resources. Finally, alternative 4 is modeled after the SB 100 core scenario and has 24 million metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent in 2045 and covers loads associated with retail sales of electricity. Like alternatives 2 and 3, generation resources aren't restricted. Next slide, please. So residential and commercial buildings are responsible for roughly 25% of California's greenhouse gas emissions when accounting for fossil fuels consumed on-site and electricity demand. In addition, at least half of single-family homes in the state were built before building energy efficiency standards went into effect in the 1970s. Today, most of the energy to heat buildings and water, cook, and dry clothes is provided by natural gas. But there are commercially available electric alternatives to provide heat as an alternative to natural gas. Significant greenhouse gas emission reductions and improved air quality can be achieved through building decarbonization. Key strategies that provide a pathway to building decarbonization include clean energy supply, energy efficiency improvements in buildings and appliances, and energy demand flexibility. Several studies indicate that building electrification in the near term is needed to put California on track to achieve mid-century climate targets. The 2020 carbon neutrality study done for CARB identifies building energy efficiency and widespread building electrification amongst least regret strategies for getting to carbon neutrality. As California transitions to increased building electrification, installation of appliances with climate-friendly refrigerants is important to avoid any unintended consequences of increased greenhouse gas emissions. And for the different scenarios, building energy efficiency assumptions are proposed to be the same across all scenarios and would align with a 2019 California energy demand forecast, mid-high assumptions for electric efficiency, and mid-mid assumptions for gas efficiency. In terms of building electrification, for new construction, alternatives 1, 2, and 3 have all electric appliances in new residential and commercial buildings starting in 2026. Alternative 4 would take an additional code cycle to achieve this. Now for existing buildings, in alternative 1, existing residential and commercial building end use emissions are reduced through 80% of appliance sales being electric by 2025 and 100% of sales being electric by 2030. To address remaining emissions that would be left by 2035, as not all stock would be turned over naturally, all buildings would be retrofitted to electric appliances by 2035. In alternatives 2 and 3, those have the same trajectory and take longer than alternative 1 to get to 100% electric appliance sales. For existing residential buildings, 80% of appliance sales are electric by 2030 and 100% by 2035. For existing commercial buildings, 80% of appliance sales are electric by 2030 and 100% by 2045. Appliances in alternatives 2 and 3 are replaced at the end of life versus retired early. So there will be a percentage of buildings that still use gas appliances relative to today. Without early retirements, this means a larger portion of buildings use gas appliances by 2035 in alternative 2 compared to alternative 3, since there's an extra 10 years for appliances to turn over by 2045. In alternative 3, this reduces the quantity of carbon removal from the atmosphere needed to compensate for remaining emissions. Alternative 4 is slightly less ambitious in the more near term compared to alternative 3, in that 75% of appliance sales are electric by 2030 for existing residential and commercial buildings. Now I'll hand it back to Maureen.
All right, thank you, Stephanie. We're going to begin with the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee members asking if they have comments and questions. Just as a reminder, if you want to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand function in the GoToWebinar toolbar. And my colleague Trish Johnson is going to identify if we have any EJ Advisory Committee members with their hands up. So Trish.
Hi, Maureen. This is Trish. Let's see here, just a moment. Pardon me. I currently don't see any hands for Environmental Justice Advisory Committee members raised, although I do acknowledge that a number are in attendance today. We could give it just another few seconds. Okay, there we go. So I do see Paulina Torres. So Paulina, you should be able to unmute yourself and start your comment.
Hi, everyone. Paulina Torres, EJAC member, EJAC co-chair. I guess I just probably why EJAC members are not raising their hand is because they are feeling the way I do, in that, you know, we just had an EJAC meeting on Monday and would have loved to see this information, right? I feel a little blindsided by CARB right now, just given that there was an opportunity to share this information with the EJAC and it just wasn't shared. And I think we have a lot of thoughts on, or I have a lot of thoughts on the substance, and really have concerns about the heavy reliance on biofuels and carbon capture and sequestration generally. And can go into that more, but just I think CARB will definitely hear from EJAC at the next meeting to like really dive into these issues, and hope y'all are prepared to do that. But just generally have a lot of concerns about the proposals that were raised, and don't think I have enough time right now, and don't want to take up too much time to go through them, because I imagine hopefully by now my fellow co-chairs have had a chance to raise their hand to share their concerns.
So Paulina, this is Rajinder, and I can appreciate everything you just said. We are trying to set up a meeting with the EJAC in the next 2 weeks or so that we can go into some of this detail as you all are considering how to provide some initial input on these scenarios. And so this is the first draft set that we're putting out, and we are looking to see if there are things here that you feel strongly about or supportive of, and we're going to be trying to do that with all stakeholders. So there is time to weigh in on what we ultimately model here, and it will be an iterative process. But to the extent that the EJAC members want to go through this presentation again, or we want to do some deep dives over the next several months on several topics, we're absolutely open to that. But I appreciate your comments and the sentiments that you're presenting here.
Okay, thank you, Paulina. We have had a couple of other EJAC members raise their hand. So next, I will call upon Georgette Gomez. You should be able to unmute yourself and start your comment.
Thank you, Trish. And yeah, I just want to echo Paulina's comments. This is a little bit off left field, it feels like. Haven't spent, I don't even know how many hours on Monday. I think it would have been the appropriate thing to have done to have us look at this and really spend time versus being here and seeing it for the first time. It just feels a little bit, I'm a little bit frustrated, to say the least. There are comments that I do have in regards to the scenarios, most of them related to EJ, but I'm hoping that we can correct this relationship that we have. If we're spending this much time as an EJAC member, I think I question the transparency of this effort at this moment, and even just overall the relationship that we have. So I just really want to express my frustration at this moment, and just I hope that this gets corrected sooner rather than later. Yeah, thank you.
So Georgette, we are absolutely open to hearing what things we can do to make this a more workable and transparent process. The materials that we put out yesterday and the presentation today, we're previewing that for everyone at the same time. And like I said to Paulina, over the next couple of weeks, we will be available to go into more detail on any of the topics here, so that can help inform any decision making or any input that EJAC as a body wants to provide back. We did base what we're putting out here on a significant amount of feedback that we got from a wide variety of stakeholders. And so we did our best with what the information we had on our website. This is not the final decision on what the scenarios look like, and we remain open to any input that you all want to provide. And again, the offer for us to be there to present and do a deeper dive on any of the topics, that is open and available.
And I appreciate that, Regender. I just, we spent almost half a day on Monday. I feel like even the content of that meeting was, seeing this information, I think we could have made room. So as now that we have our co-chairs, perhaps we can have a bit more of a connection to the workshops and project what's being shared, and the timing of it. I think we could have made room to have this discussion. And I mean, we had, I don't remember how many hours on Monday. We could have definitely have made some room for it and have perhaps a beginning discourse and continue the discourse during this workshop. So I just think the lining up of the timing of these conversations can be done better, to truly have a, I mean, we have an the EJAC process. So I'm just trying to understand what that process is, or should we even have that process, even though it's required. But I just don't want to. I feel a little bit blindsided. That's all I can really say. So hopefully we can improve it. And I hear you, and I'm gonna continue to trust the process. But at this moment, it's a little bit frustrating.
Okay, thank you for sharing that.
Okay, next I'll call on Sharifa Taylor. You should be able to unmute yourself and start your comment.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah, hi Sharifa.
Hi. Yeah, I want to thank Paulina and Georgette for going first. I joined the workshop maybe 20-30 minutes late because I wasn't intending on attending it today, because I have some work stuff going on that I need to attend to. But like they both have already shared, I'm just disappointed that this is the first time we're seeing these scenarios from CARB. Definitely, we will take you up, Regender, on being able to talk more intentionally about these, because this shouldn't have been the first time that we talked about it, given that we have the deadline from CARB about needing to speak about this on the 22nd, and it takes quite a bit of time and effort just to have the 4-hour discussion we have once or twice a month. Substantively, I would like to see in the next iteration of us discussing these points, the inclusion of small scale solar with storage capacity, active transportation, like such as walking and working on infrastructure, definitely the use of public transit, along with the zero emission vehicles, and especially finding out how we can include zero emission construction. Definitely, because I mostly have taken the time to look at the proposed pathway scenario modeling assumptions that were posted online since I joined late. I still need more time to look at that, but yeah, definitely trying to keep faith in this process. Yeah, we need more transparency. We need to be able to substantively talk about these things with CARB and have them meaningfully listened to and incorporated, not just have us be in feedback or reactionary mode. So yeah, honestly, you know, Georgette said it all, and so did Paulina. So I'm gonna end my comments here, but yeah, I just feel very blindsided and disappointed by what's going on today.
So Sharifa, thank you for your comments. You know, the offer that we still have to do the deep dives, that is still there. And this is an iterative process. And so, you know, we are trying to balance the need to keep some of the work going because of the timeline that we have. And I know that there is an outstanding question on timelines and concerns raised by the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. But really, this again is our very first time trying to put something together that reflects all of the stakeholder comments that we received. This is in no ways final, and your thoughts and your input are very valuable in the process. And we still have time to consider how to include that and have the deep dives and the discussions that you all want. I really appreciated your flag even right now about the small scale solar. That's helpful input as well. So to the extent that there are other things that are important, technology-wise or scenario-wise, absolutely want to make sure that we provide the space and time to get that from you.
Okay, thank you, Sharifa. The last hand I see from an EJAC member is Kevin Jefferson. Kevin, you should be able to unmute yourself and start your, oh, excuse me, there's another, but Kevin, go ahead.
Hello, my name is Kevin Jefferson. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, Kevin, go ahead.
Yeah, so I would just like to say that this process right here, what we're doing today, seems like it was very, for lack of a better words, non-transparent. And in order for this process to work, we have to be absolutely transparent. So I would like to know who made the decision to have this meeting today without informing the EJAC or sharing the information with the EJAC. If we could have that information, for one, and for two, with that decision-making person or team, is it possible for that person or team to meet with the EJAC committee so that we could work together on the process of how we work together, future meetings and future understandings? Because what we're doing today simply washed away all that we've done the other day. A lot of time and effort went into that meeting the other day. If we had this information, that meeting would have went tremendously different. This process of scoping plan is for this year is or for what we're currently doing consists of several other scoping plans and processes and EJAC committee meetings and things of that nature over the past years. With more, and what I mean by that is that we didn't just come together with this new team. We didn't just get together and start this process. It's been a long, long process. So for us to get to this process, this moment in this process, and to be simply blindsided by some new information as if we're starting is totally unfair, a waste of a lot of people's time and efforts, and it's really not cool. So I think we should work together more on the future of how we have these meetings with the EJAC, how we do this process so that we're not wasting time. Because currently it could be easily surmised that we have two different operations going. We have the EJAC committee that's tremendously working on this effort. And then we have CARB that's doing their thing and it's not together, to the point where we're just some folks over here with some good ideas, throwing them at you, but nobody's listening. So I think we should get together with who's ever making these decisions to have these unparalleled processes working together so they are parallel.
So this is Rajinder, and I will offer one bit of observation on the timing of the workshop and the content of the workshop. The workshop that we're having today had been noticed at least 2 weeks ahead of time, and it had been flagged in emails, I think at least twice, to the EJAC members that we were going to have this workshop. And so I'm sorry that it feels like the workshop today is a surprise and it's blindsiding some of the members here. But I think we have been trying to make sure that as we become aware or we're thinking about holding workshops, we're giving that information on to the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee members. I know that now that we have the co-chairs, we have an opportunity to work more collaboratively and more timely with them to make sure that in our regular check-ins with them, they are aware of these things that are happening and make sure that we get that information out. If there is another way for us to communicate what is coming up, happy to figure out what that looks like and work through that process.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I do see another EJAC member here, Nina Mohan. You should be able to unmute yourself and start your comment.
Thank you, Trish, and thank you, CARB staff, for the presentation. This is Nina Mohan with the California Environmental Justice Alliance and also a member of the EJAC. Definitely resonate with what my colleagues on the EJAC have shared around the process and transparency concerns. I did also feel a bit taken aback by the material that was presented today. I do have two brief substantive comments that I can name now. The first is which my interpretation of 3 out of 4 of the scenarios violate AB 197 because they will in fact increase pollution in impacted communities and do not address directly reducing emissions in those communities. And I would love in the future if for all of these scenarios there could be an environmental justice analysis that's associated with that and presented with that. And secondly, I want to kind of build off of what my colleague Sharifa named earlier. To me, it feels a little bit hard to think about continuing to do things that way that we have been doing things and expect something to change, you know, in terms of being able to live, you know, on our planet in the future if we keep going down the pathway that we're going. And so, again, I think having some visionary thinking around, you know, as Sharifa was mentioning, the mass transit, the solar storage, like there are other alternative technologies that we can use for building materials. You know, there's a lot of potential out there and a lot of ways that we can continue to shift towards something that is more sustainable and more equitable and that reduces pollution in communities. Like all 3 of those things are possible. They don't have to be juxtaposed against each other. So I really am hoping that in future conversations about these scenarios, we can start to bring in a little bit more of that visionary thinking. So I'll stop there. Thanks for the time today.
Thanks, Nina. Again, we will be doing deep dives with the EJAC on these areas and completely open to new technologies and all of your input there.
Okay, that concludes the comments from the EJAC members.
All right, thank you, Trish. We are now going to take a 15-minute break, and so we will return at 10:15, and then we will open it up for the webinar attendees to make their comments or ask questions. Okay, so a 15-minute break. We'll see you at 10:15. Hello, welcome back to the rest of the workshop. Lon, could you please advance the slide? Thank you. Okay, so we are ready to begin the public participation part of the workshop today. Just as a reminder, if you would like to ask a question or make a comment, please use the raise hand feature of the GoToWebinar. My colleague Courtney Caro is going to be calling on people. So let's go ahead and begin, Courtney.
So at this moment, we have 17 hands raised for comments. The first 3 comments we'll be taking, and apologies in advance if I mispronounce your name, will be from Brian Kaloji, Julia Levin, and Brian McDonald. Brian Kaloji, you're up first. I have unmuted you, and you should be able to provide your comment.
Hello, and thank God for this webinar by CARB with emphasis on leading with options to manage carbon emissions in California and hopefully for the rest of the nation and world. My name is Brian Kaloji, announcing solutions to achieve carbon neutrality in California by 2035 that are not included in the current options presented by CARB today. This is especially clear in the emission of sustainable and renewable natural gas combustion technologies that assist with the transition in reducing natural gas consumption by over 70% by raising the temperature of combustion with oxy-combustion technologies. I invite the attendees, CARB and the attendees, to Google process heating tip number 3, okay? It will then show the USD OE, United States Department of Energy chart for oxy-combustion that shows raising the temperature of combustion and reducing the consumption of natural gas, again, by 70%, which is a huge greenhouse gas reduction concept. And this is especially needed by the aforementioned high temperature industrial processes such as cement that are being threatened with disenfranchisement in California. This technology, again, is not new. It's been around for 40 years. And at the American Institute of Chemical Engineers meeting this spring, Kaloji Corp presented a method to produce oxygen with direct air oxygen and CO2 with direct air capture from air that captures CO2 and oxygen directly from air, that uses membranes that have, again, been around for 40 years. In fact, 2 major manufacturers are here in California, and they actually they can reduce the natural gas consumption of any fire facility by up to 70% and raise the temperature of the combustion. This was the keynote presentation at the Spring National Meeting. So I encourage people, especially at CARB, to bring oxy-combustion into play, especially with novel and recently patent-pending technologies out there that are not under consideration and that actually solve some of these major problems with the high temperature issues. And also, you mentioned biogas. When oxy-combustion is used with biogas, biogas usually requires natural gas to supplement the fuel. With oxy-combustion, you require no natural gas, and you could be 100% sustainable biogas firing with with oxy-combustion at very low levels. So that's my comment. Kaloji Corp has these technologies patent pending, and they've been around for the science and in many other ways have been around for over 40 years. And thank you very much again, CARB, for having this presentation and giving us this power of breath. Thank God for that.
Thank you, Brian. We appreciate that comment.
Next, we have Julia Levin.
Good morning, Julia Levin with the Bioenergy Association of California. I want to thank CARB staff for the presentations, and especially at the beginning mentioning the need to focus on both emissions sources and sinks. I am concerned, though, I think I've attended all of the scoping plan workshops so far. There has been very little focus on the sink side of the equation. And so I hope that in the coming couple of months, CARB will hold more workshops on carbon sinks. Above all, natural and working lands, which are hugely important to the state's climate goals overall and lots of other goals, but also technologies that can remove carbon from the air. The climate science is really clear that even if we do everything we can to reduce emissions, that's not going to be enough. We need to focus on pulling carbon out of the air as well. So I really hope there will be one or more workshops that focus in much more detail on the sink side of the equation. On the emissions side, there are 2 points I'd like to make. The first is, while I appreciate and totally support phasing out fossil fuels as quickly as possible, and also the efforts to reduce methane, I am baffled as to why there has been absolutely no mention today and in many of the previous workshops on anthropogenic black carbon emissions. Anthropogenic black carbon is by far the largest source of short-lived climate pollutants, or the single largest short-lived climate pollutant emission in California. We can't possibly meet our climate goals without addressing it, and yet it hasn't even been discussed. So we really need to deal with the fact that state law says we must reduce anthropogenic black carbon 50% by 2030. There's no way we're going to achieve that goal if we don't even talk about that goal. So again, I hope that there is a workshop focused specifically on ways to reduce anthropogenic black carbon, and especially because the 3 biggest sources are human-caused wildfires, controlled burns of forest and ag waste, and diesel, all of which are major sources of air pollution. And diesel in particular, we should have a very focused effort to get rid of diesel as fast as possible. It causes half of the air pollution in the San Joaquin Valley and is the largest source of air pollution in the South Coast Air District as well. The last point I wanted to make is about choosing technology winners and losers versus carbon intensity-based standards. I think that the low carbon fuel standard sets a really important model for the way to approach climate emissions reductions, which is science-based. Simply pointing to technologies, regardless of their actual carbon emissions, is not going to help us achieve our climate goals. And just to give a few examples, we use the term zero emission vehicle, which is only about tailpipe emissions and is actually about NOx, not carbon reductions. So I drive an electric car. I fully support electrifying transportation where we can, but my car runs on the California power grid, which is not zero carbon. On the flip side, my next door neighbor has a natural gas vehicle that runs 100% on biogas. It's now carbon negative. In fact, it's providing 3 times the carbon reductions that my so-called zero emission vehicle provides. So, and similarly with combustion of biogas can still be very carbon negative. Well, other technologies like solar, wind, and batteries are not zero carbon on a life cycle basis. So I think it's really critical that all of our emissions reduction programs and our climate programs move to a life cycle carbon intensity basis. That is the only way we can really measure accurately whether we're achieving our climate goals or not. Thank you.
Hi, Julia. Thanks for that comment. Sorry, I get off mute there. I just wanted to flag a couple of responses real quickly. So on the question about and the request that we hold more workshops on the sink side, we did have a workshop on natural and working lands about a month ago, talking about the modeling approach that we are looking at and we're pursuing for natural and working lands. And we are planning on more workshops in that space, and so there will be more coming on kind of the types of scenario assumptions we also need to do for modeling sinks and sources from natural and working lands, and so that's going to be coming in the future. And then with respect to some of your comments on black carbon and short-lived climate pollutants, I do want to remind folks that we did do a workshop earlier this month on short-lived climate pollutants. We did talk about the 1383 targets, our progress towards the 1383 targets, including black carbon, and how we've approached black carbon emission reductions in the state, particularly in our diesel programs, which are driving a significant portion of black carbon reductions in California. So those slides are available on our scoping plan workshops page, and I encourage folks to take a look at those, as well as in providing feedback to us as part of these scenarios and the types of strategies that you are recommending for evaluation as part of the alternatives.
Next, we have Brian McDonald. Brian, you're up next.
All right, hey, thank you. Good morning to everybody. I'm more of a question than comments, but did want to highlight the information that CARB is providing in this workshop is quite plentiful, and appreciate that. It really helps to understand where everything is going in the scoping plan scenarios. So back to my question. So it's really around the biofuel section here. In the 2018 scoping plan, there was a module, an Excel-based module that was used to really kind of plan out what the expected supply of these renewable fuels would be through, I think, 2030. Is the expectation that that module is going to be revisited or revised to update into this 2045 and or possibly 2035 scenarios? How's CARB looking at trying to project what those volumes may be within the scoping plan?
So hi, Brian, this is Rajinder. I'll just say that you're right in recalling that we had the biofuel supply module for the last scoping plan. We're going to try and do something similar. It may not be in the same form as that Excel spreadsheet, but understanding what kinds of biofuels can come online and the feedstocks available is a question that we want to look at. And as part of the evaluation on progress to 2030, there will be some information there as well on feedstock costs and what's available and what we think will be available through this decade and beyond this decade. So yes, definitely going to look at it. It may just not be in that form again.
Our next three commenters are Chuck White, Kathleen Van Austin, and Sasan Sadat. Chuck, you are up to comment.
Hi, this is Chuck White with Manette, Phelps and Phillips. I kind of want to echo what my colleague Julia Levin expressed, actually, though I'm a little bit more optimistic, because I'm really glad to see the potential for the scoping plan to begin to provide a little more balance between the various aspects of climate change and reducing climate pollutants. For example, the Clean Fleet Rule was really focusing only on electric vehicles for the most part, at least until recently. And then you've got the short-lived climate pollutants with respect to methane, really looking at ways to reduce methane emissions. And one of the best ways to do it, I think, as Julia well pointed out, is through producing biofuels. And biofuels have a complete life cycle assessment that, at least at present, is much better in terms of climate pollutant reduction. So I'm really hopeful that this process you're going through, regardless of what alternative you look at, you'll begin to take a look at the opportunity for biofuels from the agricultural, from the forest, and the urban sectors that themselves have significant CO2 and, as Julia pointed out, short-lived climate pollutant implications, and how the scoping plan needs to look at the global picture of the overall ability from a life cycle and carbon intensity basis of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And I'm very hopeful that you will take a much closer look at balancing the benefits of biofuel production versus going totally electric in terms of a life cycle and carbon intensity basis. Thank you very much.
Our next commenter is Sasan Sadat. Sasan, you are unmuted and are free to deliver your comment. Sasan, you might have to unmute yourself.
How am I coming through? Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Yeah, Sasan Sadat with Earth Justice. Thank you to the CARB staff for presenting and to the EJAC members. We submitted written comments and I didn't necessarily see them reflected in all of the obviously I'm sure you have a lot of stakeholders, but I just wanted to go through a few of them since yeah, there's a few slides where I think our input we would really love to see reflected in at least one of the alternatives. So to start with the carbon neutrality targets overall, it looked like you were offering in your aggressive scenarios 1 and 2 either 45% reduction by 2030 or 55%. And we lay out in our comments why that is extremely unambitious compared to other leading, like other nations leading on climate. Our 40% target is obviously out of date, so it's good that you're planning to increase it for 2030. But Germany's target is 65%. The UK under Conservative Boris Johnson is 68%. Denmark's is 70%. The EU as a whole is 55%. So California's should really be, if you want to look at an ambitious scenario for 2030, it's going to need to be upwards of 65%. That's just the standard now for people setting their 2030 targets now relative to the 1990 baseline. So there's no reason for California to continue to lag, especially if we're in the process of updating. We shouldn't be updating so incrementally low. And then my next point is sort of that we really support the governor's request to pursue carbon neutrality by 2035. And we're glad that CARB staff are looking at a possibility of achieving that. Our concern, I guess, with CARB's current set of options is that if staff finds carbon neutrality in 2035 is not possible with existing technologies or just like not practical with currently projected costs, then you automatically punt to the 2045 target. This seems unnecessary, right? Because it obviously missing 2035 narrowly, but achieving it, say, in 2039 is obviously better than 2045. So we saw, it aims to achieve for the 2035 or to the 2030 targets. We think you should apply that for the 2035 target as well, so that if you narrowly miss it, you're not automatically punting another 10 years. On CCS, and the industrial sector, it's great to see you break it out in a little bit more detail between the sources of industrial emissions. In general, we strongly oppose the use of CCS for any type of process heat emissions or fossil fuel extraction. So in those sectors, we have at least enough research to show us that electrification or the use of green hydrogen or the use of demand reduction strategies and demand management strategies can manage process heat and even high temperature industrial heat, so that we don't need to rely on carbon capture. And we know that we have a finite amount of geologic storage, and a lot of that is going to be needed for direct air capture. So minimizing reliance on CCS in the industrial sector so that it's only for cement or truly unavoidable emissions is really important. I'll just skip forward past the electric grid because I know I'm taking up a lot of time. The vehicle electrification targets, I think this is CARB's greatest opportunity to accelerate reductions needed under any scenario, and especially in the near term. So the 100% ZE sales target for light duty vehicles should be set to 2030. Several countries are doing this. A bunch of the people who ran for the Democratic presidential primary set 2030 targets for the US as a whole. There's no reason for California to continue to undershoot. We provided slides showing California's zero emission sales penetration rates. we started way ahead of France, Germany, and the UK, and now they're all leagues ahead of us. It's not that complicated. They set stringent CO2 targets, and now sales of EVs are surging way ahead of us. Germany is around 20% already. And the problem is California's regulations, the Advanced Clean Cars 2 regulation, is undershooting what's needed in the mobile source strategy, which in turn is also inadequate to reach the scoping plan. So it's really key that in the key regulatory mechanisms we have to achieve these targets, we're not misaligned. And then also, I hope the scoping plan aligns our targets themselves so that they're sufficient to meet our carbon neutrality goals. And finally, on the use of biogas, I know that there are a lot of biogas industry folks who got to comment first. We know from the E3 achieving carbon neutrality scenarios, first of all, the zero carbon scenario should really be adopted as the default, since AB 197 says that we need to reduce emissions directly as much as possible. There is a very limited supply of genuinely sustainable biogas. And this fiction that capturing methane from anthropogenic waste is carbon removal, it's one of the biggest, it's one of the most unscientific things and a huge environmental justice problem. And CARB should urgently be working to avoid that. Like, all of our zero emission goals are aligned around truly zero emission transportation system. And yet the LCFS creates the fiction that driving a gas powered vehicle is equivalent to taking 3 cars off the road, because it treats the pollution from dairy factory farms as though it is inevitable and a natural feature of our society, when we know it's not. So correcting that and making sure that the role for genuinely sustainable biogas is treated in correspondence with its actual supply is really important. And yeah, so I hope we can talk in more detail about any of these points, but thank you so much for the opportunity to comment.
Thanks, Saison. Really appreciated your detailed comments and the points that you're making. Thank you.
Our next 3 commenters are Mick Svarla, Todd Campbell, and Shelley Johnson. Mick, you are up first. You may have to unmute yourself.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. I just want to express my appreciation for staff posting materials early. Having those yesterday, provided a lot of insights into what we're going to be discussing today, and just wanted to extend that on behalf of my client Steve, who's continually asked for early material presentations. The level of granularity at this workshop today is kind of what we've been looking for in this process. And we know that you guys had to do a lot of preliminary workshops to build to this point. So wanted to, again, kind of express appreciation for that. Having kind of these details on the 4 scenarios is tremendously helpful. Allow kind of all stakeholders at the table to really dig in and provide a level of comment that I don't think you've seen in previous workshops. To that end, I think we've heard some comments today about various technologies that are preferred in or out, and I really think that this is the opportunity where the modeling comes through, and look forward to kind of seeing the results of those details, and with stakeholders providing various inputs such as cost data and health outcomes. And I think that will really help inform kind of these 4 scenarios. I do have a question though. I know there's been a lot of EJAC workshops and questions asked with regards to scenarios. It was my impression that there was going to be a 5th scenario that they designed. Where does that stand in the process? And is that something that we're going to see in these workshops coming up? I know you guys have been doing a lot of outreach on that side, asking these questions that have led to these 4 scenarios. Is there going to be that, and is there going to be an opportunity for a 6th scenario that potentially industry and compliance entities can design, so that we can see the results of that as well?
Thanks for those comments, Mick. And to your questions, I think at least one of the scenarios that we're presenting today has been informed significantly by feedback that we got from letters submitted by environmental justice advocates. If there's an opportunity to modify, I think it's alternative 1 to be more in line with what the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee provides as input, we will be trying to do that. As far as an industrial sector or a different scenario, we can look into that, but there's also an opportunity to take the scenarios that we have and get feedback on alterations to any one of those to more appropriately and comprehensively reflect any input coming from the labor groups and the industrial and regulated entity groups and utilities. So if you provide the feedback, we will do our best to figure out if it's a whole new scenario or if we can modify one of the existing ones to reflect that input. Thank you.
Next, we have Todd Campbell. Todd, please go ahead and unmute yourself and introduce yourself before providing your comment.
Am I on?
Yeah.
You can hear me. Okay, great.
Yes.
Sorry, fumbling around on my computer. It's like pure sign that I'm getting older. Hi, good morning. My name is Todd Campbell, and I wanted to thank the California Resources Board staff for releasing the materials early, and I had no difficulty with the notice, and I thought you did a good job there, and I also want to thank you for taking a broad look at multiple scenarios that properly evaluate where we can go and how we can hit our greenhouse gas and emissions goals. I wanted to say that I'm very supportive of Julia's point regarding anthropogenic black carbon, specifically diesel, and I think as I go through my comments, I'll make that very clear as to why that's so critical. But her point about addressing short-lived climate pollutants is of urgent necessity, especially given the timeline that we've been given worldwide to curb climate change. So I think that is incredibly important. I also want to argue that performance-based standards like the low carbon fuel standard are critical, not only from a measurement standpoint, but also from an investment standpoint. We are, at the possible potential extinction at some point of the planet if we're not able to move quickly, or if we are not able to move fast enough, we may make conditions on Earth fairly unfriendly, and I think we're already starting to see that. So as we approach getting to zero, which by the way is a Herculean task and will take substantial time, and I say that's just based on my experience being in this field since the late 90s. Coming from the environmental community, I mean, look at the light duty ZEV market. Incredibly important program, but we started that in 1990, and we're still in the single digits when it comes to market penetration. The point I'm making is not to downplay the program. I think the program is incredibly important, but highlights the overwhelming challenges we are in when it comes to making this transition. You need vehicles that are commercially viable and work. You need robust infrastructure to support those vehicles, which many that are the most damaging diesel trucks don't always go around in short stints. A lot of them travel from point to point. So you need that infrastructure reliability, and then you need renewable fuels to power that. There's a lot of criticism about biomethane or renewable natural gas, but let's all face it, being a former mayor of Burbank, we're getting a lot of power from Intermountain Power, which is a coal plant in Utah, which I flew to, and it's huge and monstrous and disgusting. But our power that's powering the zero emission tailpipe cars isn't exactly the cleanest and by far dirtier than biomethane. So focusing on renewable fuels, I feel, is critical to solve climate change now and in the later part. And let me explain. Biofuels will reduce carbon now from internal combustion engines, and preferably those are low NOx, if not better engines. And later, they can be used to power electric and hydrogen vehicles when those vehicles are fully commercialized. One speaker earlier stated that they were very opposed to biofuel production and asked the agency to just pursue a zero-only strategy. But I think we all should realize what that really means. It means more diesel, longer in our communities, especially our disadvantaged communities, for several decades. When we know the fuel is a known carcinogen, a chemical that causes reproductive harm, is a substantial short-lived climate pollutant, is the #1 source of pollution in the South Coast and the San Joaquin. And that's not a future I believe that speaker would really wish on anyone. So we need to encourage critical investments now that work and can solve now. So I would strongly encourage CARB to adopt a strategy that would set a performance-based life cycle policy that disincentivizes the continued use of fossil fuels, promotes the use of biofuels, and removes diesel as quickly as possible. And finally, the low carbon fuel standard is not fiction. I worked with Richard Corey and CARB staff for many years. It's probably one of the most critical science-based tools we have in our tool shed. The biomethane market is growing rapidly across the country. We've seen 42% growth from 2019 to 2020, especially in areas where LCF programs are being adopted, and they are being adopted because there's a lot of evidence that they do reduce carbon. And it has been a leading strategy to reduce California's carbon emissions. There's no doubt about it. You could look it up. CARB has done a very good job here. So projections for biomethane supply are significant and robust. It's just false to say that science is, the science is wrong, or we should ignore the lowest carbon fuel under the standard. To be quite honest, I've seen a lot of stuff out there that just wouldn't pass any kind of scientific test. And I'd be more than happy to share, go toe to toe on science with biomethane. So with that, I just want to thank CARB staff for today's workshop, for noticing it very prominently and for providing the materials ahead of time. Keep up the good work. And those are my comments.
Thanks, Todd. This is Rajinder. I think I'll just note one observation on what you just shared, and that is that, the transportation sector is producing the largest share of GHG emissions and harmful air pollution in the state, and that we are going to be working closely with the groups dealing with the state implementation strategy to achieve our air quality targets. And we will be trying to align what technologies they need for air quality, meeting the air quality targets, with what we include in the scoping plan. And so I think it's really important to remind folks that almost exclusively on the transportation side in the scoping plan, we try to be at least as stringent as what is in the state implementation strategies to achieve our air quality standards, because we have to meet both. And one of them is tied to federal funding on transportation. And so that is an internal coordination that has to happen between the two types of pollutants. Thanks.
Shelley Johnson, you are unmuted. Please unmute yourself and feel free to provide your comment.
Hi, I'm Shelley Johnson. I'm assuming everyone can hear me now, but I want to echo quite a few of the folks and just being gracious for this time to hear what your plan is and also have a little bit of input for comments. I probably most wholeheartedly agree with Julia and Chuck and Todd and their comments, because it is quite a technical task to overcome these issues, especially when there's the products that are being made today are because there's consumer demand for it. So certainly taking into account consumers are using and want to use a lot of the products that are out there, and they give us a lot of opportunity that do provide health benefits and other opportunities that we all enjoy. So some of my comments specifically with these plans, which can be very aggressive. One is kind of reality versus ideology of these plans, either looking at 2035 to 2045 for net zero targets. How do you actually choose which scenario? Because in all of the scenarios, you're really looking at every industry, every sector, every person cooperating in a very idealistic way. And what happens if one sector is not able to meet the goals of that certain standard or goal for the part that they're supposed to play. Another one is in consideration of turning everything to electricity. Electricity comes from something. That is not something we just find on this earth. So certainly I echo the comments about looking at life cycle analysis for this, and also energy efficiency of each technology, whether it is looking at natural gas directly to the end user, or natural gas that is then converted to hydrogen, that is then going through a fuel cell to create electricity. Natural gas being burned in your home furnace, which is pretty efficient, versus converting that to electricity to then go into your electric furnace. I would like to see a lot of details on the energy efficiency, a little more planned out. And this also follows on to transportation. Right now, certainly there's a lot of ways that California could go in improving public transportation. California may have the worst public transportation of all states, I'm not sure. But certainly looking at ways other than battery electric. Certainly if you look globally at the impact on batteries within the world, it's not a very pretty thing. And just because California has the battery electric vehicles in their state, that doesn't mean that they've left the rest of the world in a great condition. Looking at mining or labor rights or recycling of the batteries. So, and then we bring in the electricity sector emissions too. So that's something I would like to see more clarity on, and actually achieving these goals, whether it be for 2035, 2040, 2045, and what that looks like. And I certainly agree with not having technology forcing regulations, but carbon intensity or some limit or standard of regulations put in here. And yeah, so I think to sum up my comments, just a real impact on seeing what California thinks their impact on life cycle of each technology, and also understanding what the impact on the world as a whole are. Because if California wants to be a leader in this, if they can achieve it at the expense of everyone, that's not really achieving something great. But if they can do it while making the rest of the world a better place, then that would be a good thing. And that's the end of my comments.
Thanks, Shelley. Thanks, Amy. Just want to, sorry, Shelley, I'm looking at the list here. Just wanted to say that I appreciate the comments, and that, you know, as part of this work, obviously we're developing a plan that can be a model for other jurisdictions, and it's critically important that other states, other nations also adopt aggressive greenhouse gas targets. And that's, you know, kind of why we're here, to be able to export the strategies that we need for California, and then also to not just, you know, move our emissions into other parts of the nation or the world. A quick comment on kind of the evaluation of the various end uses and technologies. As part of the scenario modeling that we're doing here, with the model that we're utilizing, which is developed by E3 called Pathways, does look at kind of the various energy conversion and energy loss values associated with different technologies, and switching energy between different technologies and types. All right, next comment.
Next, we have Muriel Strand, Evelyn Loya, and Kyle Hisakawa. Muriel, you are up. Please unmute yourself and provide your comment.
Okay, I'm Muriel Strand. I am a retired air resources engineer. I'm just really speaking as a private citizen. I just wanted to share some information that I came across recently. It was reported that the IMF has estimated that fossil fuel subsidies in the United States amount to $600 billion a year. So I just wanted to share that because clearly we're all facing a significant headwind. Now, obviously, that's not all, being subsidized here in California, but we probably get more than our share. The other economic factor that I wanted to bring up is that the sustainable discount rate is 0. That is to say, the future is as valuable as the present. And really that is taking a species, a civilization perspective rather than an individual perspective. So I really appreciate all the information, and I was not aware that some had been posted early. It's pretty dense, and I look forward to digesting some of this. And I'll be submitting some written comments presently. But I also wanted to respond a bit to some of the angst that I heard from EJAC members. And it occurs to me that it's not exactly a level playing field because staff and industry are drawing salaries to do this stuff. But at least some EJAC members, I think, are doing this on their own time. So really a level playing field would be if EJAC members got salaries for being on that advisory committee. So anyway, I really appreciate the opportunity to comment, and I look forward to following the process. Thank you.
Hey, Muriel, thanks for the feedback. I want to make just one quick comment on that. So as part of the participation in the Environmental Justice Advisory Committee, the committee members are compensated. They are provided a per diem, so there is compensation that comes from the state for that.
Next, we have Evelyn Loya. Evelyn, please unmute yourself and provide your comment.
Hi, good morning. I'm Evelyn Loya of SoCal Gas, and I'd just like to say that we recognize and appreciate the magnitude of analytical efforts and resources CARB has undertaken to date. We also appreciate CARB's diligence to transparency to a fair public process this morning, so thank you. With that said, I would like to ask a clarification question. In Stephanie's presentation on slide 21, it looks like alternatives 2 and 3 are identical. Was that intentional, or were 80% and 100% deadlines for the residential and commercial electrified appliances supposed to be different in alternatives 2 and 3? Thank you.
Hi there. Just to clarify, they are identical. I did, I guess, point out that, without some modifications, that means there's a greater percentage of buildings in alternative 2 that haven't yet turned over because we don't have early retirement assumptions embedded in there right now.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Next, we have Kyle Heiskala. Kyle, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Kyle Heiskala. I'm a climate justice policy advocate with Environmental Health Coalition, an environmental justice organization based in San Diego and Tijuana region. A few comments this morning. First of all, I wanted to express some concern was relayed by the EJAC members. I wanted to echo that it feels like this isn't really a collaborative process based on their comments, that it's one thing to do information sharing and provide materials with the EJAC, but it feels like there could be more co-development with the materials ahead of time to really bring in environmental justice advocates into the process. Back in 2017, the version of the scoping plan had the environmental justice points included as an appendix, and this time around we have an opportunity to go beyond that and ensure that environmental justice communities are not left out or a second thought in this scoping plan update, but they're really integrated. So my second comment is I would hope that in future workshops, the scenarios and the alternatives that are laid out has impacts and analysis of how this will harm or benefit environmental justice communities across the state, so that it is seen together with these proposed actions. I know that and I've heard the response from CARB staff previously that a public health and air quality analysis will be done after the technology and energy inputs are determined. However, there needs to be some consideration about the further harm that could be caused by these alternatives that are being considered and proposed at this point in the process. Air quality impacts and public health impacts need to be integrated into the entire process if it is truly to further environmental justice. To my last point, and the biggest one that I wanted to really highlight, the missing piece that I see on the transportation sector is that electrification of vehicles is one thing, but CARB isn't looking at increasing massive investments towards mass transit to make sure that it is reliable and affordable to get people out of their cars in the first place and offer a transformative transportation system. We need to go beyond just electrifying the amount of vehicles we have on the roads. We can't just continue to have reliance on single occupancy vehicles. It's not a very equitable system. I would also like to see CARB look at greater targets and goals for the metropolitan planning organizations, targets for greenhouse gas reductions, to be increasing those over the next 10 years. Only looking at VMT targets doesn't necessarily go far enough. We need to hold the large metropolitan areas accountable through greater GHG reduction targets and prioritizing mass transit to reduce the overall transportation sector emissions. Thank you.
Thanks, Kyle. This is Rajinder. I'll just weigh in on one piece and then ask Jordan to speak to the VMT part of this. The reason that we're not showing any air quality or environmental analyses at this point with the scenarios today is because we need to model the scenarios first in pathways to get fuel data and to get GHG emissions data that we can then run through air quality models and economic models and consider the environmental and local air quality impacts. And so there is a system that's set up to actually go through this through the different models. It's sequential. We definitely will include those, but the first step really has to be that pathways modeling, and that's why we're focused on the inputs here today. Jordan, did you want to speak to the VMT piece?
Hi, thanks for dinner. Yeah, just a quick note as well. We hear you on the VMT piece, and the assumptions that are in these 4 scenarios are pretty aggressive, especially alternative 1, and they likely include things like improvements of transit systems and greater investment. Thanks.
We have 16 commenters left. The next 3 will be Hannah Losi, Shada Azamian, and Christopher LaBelle. Hannah, please unmute yourself.
Excuse me. Hello, this is Kathleen Van Osten. I was called about an hour, 45 minutes ago, and I was never called upon to testify.
Hi, Kathleen. It shows that your hand was lowered, so we apologize for missing that, but please feel free to go ahead and provide your comment. Hannah, we will get to you next.
Okay, I apologize for butting in. I know there was something amiss here, so I appreciate that. Kathy Van Osten, representing United Airlines. The commercial aviation industry has expressed an interest in participating and being part of the scoping plan, as evidenced by legislation introduced earlier this year. Frankly, we're a little surprised to see it in your presentation today. We have had some conversation with your executive director, and I believe Regina as well. But we're happy to be a part of the conversation. We want to be a part of the conversation. We do think that we need to do a much deeper dive with CARB staff in terms of where we are with technologies, where we are with sustainable aviation fuel, where we are with infrastructure. Your presentation, your 4 alternatives, I can certainly tell you off the bat, number one is just, it's completely unrealistic. We're not even close to having electrification fuel cell technology ready by 2035. Out of all of your alternatives, United would say that option 2 is closer to the possibilities, but we still think there's a lot of need for conversation, discussion about that. We have the airlines, many of the airlines have invested millions of dollars into promoting and assisting in the production and the startup of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF, production. As you may recall, a few years back, United Airlines really led the effort to get sustainable aviation fuel included in the LCFS. So we were pleased with that step. And what it did was it incentivized additional production and additional investment, in particular in one facility in California. But we do need to see, one, your proposals really reflect where technology is, where we are with sustainable aviation fuels. We're at the very, very beginning of the process. The goals that you've set for use of alternative fuels, biofuels, we just don't see how production can get there at this snapshot at the rate we're moving. We also need, at least a good $150 million in infrastructure investment in California, pipelines, et cetera. Even if we have refineries converting to the production of alternative fuels, in particular alternative aviation fuel, we do need infrastructure to get it to the airport, to particular holding tanks, in particular at our larger airports. So we do believe that the one way to get there, to get to the 25% that you want to see, to get to the 50%, we share interest in those goals. We think the longer term goals are closer to being more practical, but if we don't start investing now, it will never happen the way that you would like to see it and the way we would like to see it. So I think we do need to continue incentivizing production. The demand for SAF is there. United just announced a huge deal with Alder Fuels to produce SAF, and we've made an incredibly significant investment and commitment to purchase fuel over the next 10 years. So we just wanted to make that comment. We would love to sit down with CARB staff and provide a little bit more information on where we are, not only on SAF production, but where we frankly are not yet on electrification by way of fuel cells and so forth. So we would request that, invite that, and we definitely look forward to working with you on that.
Thank you for that offer. I have one request, that if we're going to be providing data to CARB staff, it would be really good to make sure it's in the public submittal process, because we do want to make sure that we're being transparent, not only on the data that we're relying on, but the kinds but also who's providing that data. So happy to meet with you and be available, but would really appreciate anything that you provide us to also be something we can post on our website. Thanks.
Next, we have Hannah Losi. Hannah, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, hopefully you can hear me. Hannah Losi, Tricord Consulting. I got one comment and a question. So I just want to bring up the issue of waste from mass early retirement for things like boilers, cars, et cetera. I believe that this is something that really impacts underserved communities, and it's something that I would hope that CARB would consider when proposing early retirements of these heavy industry items. My question is on what kind of analysis has been done to show that these proposed alternatives will actually achieve the desired outcome? I was wondering if somebody from CARB could comment on that.
Sure, I can jump in. So this is, for this workshop, what we're discussing right now are the inputs and the assumptions that we would put into the modeling, the greenhouse gas and energy modeling that will come as an outcome from these inputs. So this is about what should we be putting into that model, and then that will in turn result in some additional emissions modeling that we will then bring back to the public sphere. So no analysis yet, but that is the outcome.
Next, we have Sheda Azamian. Sheda, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hello, this is Sheda Azamian from the Leadership Council for Justice and Accountability. I look forward to discussing these proposed scenarios in great depth. I want to thank CARB for the presentation and EJAC members for their initial comments. We do share many of the same grave concerns around the inclusion of biofuels, natural gas, and CCS in the scoping plan. We've raised many times before, and now fear or concerns are being overlooked. Biogas in particular is not a fuel we can afford investing in and relying on, considering its serious environmental justice impacts and the exacerbation of SLCPs. Again, mass transit and pesticides reduction strategies are very noticeably missing from the scoping plan. I do see the scenarios that CARB presented today as a vast range of some unacceptable options and some options that are getting closer to centering environmental justice, though not yet there. Clearly, many of the options that prolong the use of polluting natural gas, fossil fuels, and dairy biogas are unacceptable for the scoping plan, and according to the global direction for emissions mitigation. One of my main concerns among many today is on a major area missing from the industrial transition conversation. The select environmental justice priorities that CARB reflected today in the presentation are being conflated with infeasibility without proper consideration or analysis of sustainable industrial transition strategies, as I believe Nina mentioned before. We're past the point of choosing between two polluting fuels or choosing between polluting gas or business shutdown without considering the full scope of operational transition strategies available. So I think the repeated language on this and narrow choices presented is very harmful to this process that should be lifting up all non-combustion transition strategies, even those when electric power is deemed infeasible for certain economic activities by CARB. So the rhetoric of this forced industry upheaval does not give respect or welcome the due diligence of the business community to explore alternative models that do not rely on combustion and to work with local communities to do this. We need to be exceedingly nuanced about this because, as we've seen now, this rhetoric then paints equity and fairness as unreasonable. The scenarios we just saw do shrug much of this conversation that needs to happen around sustainable alternatives and how local transitions can happen safely and equitably for everyone. I was expecting to see more of this diligence and analysis of all the strategies through which industries can transition to sustainable models and operations instead of portraying environmentally and socially just scenarios as contrary to economic stability. Environmental justice and economic stability are not opposed. In fact, each hinges on the other if you're able to see even a little farther down the road. But the rhetoric today is now out there, and I ask that CARB staff correct this framing and this assumption in the scenarios immediately going forwards, and I hope to see more of an analysis of non-combustion transition strategies for industries that CARB has deemed zero emission power as infeasible. Thank you.
Shada, thanks for those comments. As we teed up in the presentation, if there are specific technologies or strategies that you think we need to look at and include, it'd be really good to get those. If it's literature, we're happy to look it over, but we need to have sufficient detail on the technologies that are the alternatives, any environmental analyses that have been done on those, or potential environmental impacts of those, and any health-related and cost-related data on those technologies to be able to include them in the technical evaluation. So hear you on the point that we need to be open to other ways to decarbonize some of the sectors, but really open to seeing what other things you've been seeing or hearing about that we need to look at. Thanks.
Next, we have Christophe Lebel. Christophe, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Great. Thank you very much. For identification purposes, Christophe Lebel here. I work for the Silicon Valley Leadership Group, a regional business organization based in the Bay Area. Yeah, I just have a question for CARB staff related to the layout of the different scenarios presented today. In trying to understand them and compare them, I'm wondering if it's right to view the four scenarios or the alternatives as on a linear spectrum. So from alternative one as, say, perhaps the most aggressive or restrictive on different ways to meet different goals, whether it's reducing greenhouse gas emissions or limiting fossil fuels as part of our economy. And then as you go right to alternative four, is that the less restrictive scenario alternative? And yeah, I'm just wondering if that's useful to view the different scenarios, and then if it's not, you know, I noticed there was maybe some variation on that linear spectrum lens between the third and fourth alternatives. And so I just welcome any advice from CARB on how to compare the scenarios, alternatives as they're proposed today.
Yeah, thanks, Christopher, for those comments. So yeah, I encourage you to take a look at, you know, on slide 10 and slide 11, where we talk about, and 12, the kind of the high level pieces for each of the scenarios. I mean, the way that we've been looking at these, you know, first is the timeline. So carbon neutrality by 2035 or 2045, and then within each of those two timelines, what is some of the feedback that we've received in terms of the things that we need to look at for technology, for fuels, for fugitives, and how should we approach each of the questions around those and model those scenarios. And so certainly, you know, when it comes to reducing emissions in the near term, you know, Alt1 provides the path that is, you know, no combustion with the deepest kind of cuts in emissions in near term, and then Alt4 provides a path that provides a longer trajectory to carbon neutrality 2045, and so there are more kind of remaining emissions associated with the Alt4, and then Alt2 and 3 reflect different feedback kind of and consistency with other state plans that we've received.
Our next three commenters will be Amy Kyle, Richard Groh, and Jim Kennedy. Amy, you're up. Please unmute yourself to deliver your comment.
Hello, this is Amy Kyle. I'm an environmental health scientist, retired from UC Berkeley, and I wanted to comment about two issues. One is the question of mandate for emissions reductions that exist in more than a couple places in the statutes and guidance for the scoping plan. A couple other people have mentioned this already. And I think it would be helpful if the strategies could be categorized in terms of whether they will reduce emissions or leave them the same or increase them for the non-carbon component, and perhaps also for the carbon component. But I'm talking about the associated pollutants, because I think that would help help us see that additional mandate that is fundamental to this project and doesn't seem to have been built into this structure in any way that I can perceive. And I didn't have a chance to review everything that was posted yesterday yet. So that would be one comment. And then my other comment is about the health analysis that's to be done on these various options. And I think it's related in the sense that I think that what you're trying to do is go from the health metrics as a way of looking at the strategies. And in some cases, perhaps skipping a focus on the emissions reductions. And I think that maybe, I'm not saying you shouldn't do it, but I would say that experience has shown that CARB isn't very good at doing it with regard to environmental justice communities, in that so many of the tools that you use provide a regional scale or highly aggregated estimate for a large area that will miss the areas that are most impacted. The bigger area you average, the more you flatten out the number. And, that can be appropriate in some cases, but when you're talking about environmental justice impacts and also the diversity of sources that we're talking about here, I don't think it is appropriate. And yet, I don't think the methods that CARB has fix that very well, or maybe at all. So I'm skeptical about jumping to the health assessment when we're talking about EJ communities. And I think it would be appropriate to preserve the changes in emissions as an intermediate level that I think the information is, while still not that great in some cases, somewhat better able to represent. Thank you.
Thanks, Amy. Bear with me while I get my camera working here. I'm not sure if it's working, but what I wanted to just quickly respond to that and say that, and we've talked a little bit about this as part of a response to other comments. The inputs that we're designing right now for pathways will feed into a model that will produce kind of the energy endpoints, and then we will take that information. E3 will be handing that to UC Irvine, who will be doing an air quality and an emissions analysis, which would then feed into a public health analysis. So we talk about public health analysis that will be forthcoming as a result of the scenarios that we're going to run here, because we've heard from many folks that is the information that they really would like to see, but we are not skipping an emissions analysis. We are doing that. I do want to kind of point out too that we are centered on greenhouse gas emissions here because this is the scoping plan process, and that is our mandate to develop a plan that looks at achieving greenhouse gas emission reduction targets or carbon neutrality. So we focus first on greenhouse gas emissions and how do we achieve carbon neutrality through these scenarios. And then we pull in this additional information into the designing of the scenarios around what are some of the strategies that could also complement and support our need for air quality improvements in California. And so we talked a little bit about how each of these scenarios in their different technology deployment strategies or mitigation strategies would help do that. And we welcome feedback in designing these scenarios in ways that could continue to both help us put us on a path to carbon neutrality, but also directly reduce emissions in California, particularly on the air quality side.
Next, we have Richard Grow. Richard, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, I'm Richard Grow, retired from US EPA a couple of years ago after 40 years there working based in air quality, environmental justice, and especially at the intersection of air quality and environmental justice. In those years, I worked quite a bit with CARB staff. My general comment here goes to, and a couple of people have raised it already, the health assessment, or it was referred to by somebody from the EJAC as the EJ analysis. And even after the exchanges I've heard, I'm still concerned that CARB may not really be getting, I know it's understandable, but I want to emphasize a real EJ analysis looks way beyond greenhouse gases. It looks at the co-pollutants, looks at fine PM hazardous pollutants, and it also looks at who and where. None of this aggregation, as Amy said, no overall projections here. Various communities need to know what is happening to them. And so I'm hearing you may or may not, CARB, be headed in this level of detail. I think it's essential that you do go to that level of detail, but I'm also not seeing that it lands in the sequencing here in a way that it can affect the choice of strategies here, meaning I think, Matthew, you just described it as almost an additional consideration, and that's not environmental justice. It can't be an additional consideration. It needs to have a powerful role in determining the mix of strategies. So this health assessment, or however we want to call it, needs to be applied in a way to reveal the level of detail, community specific, demographic specific, and at a time in the process where it can affect the decision. At a little narrower context here, I noticed that the sector discussions here include several sectors that are actually subject to cap and trade. As much as I go back through the 2017 scoping plan on that, I do not see an analysis, and maybe I'm not finding it, ever taking a serious look at cap and trade, which inherently redistributes benefits and burdens from one community to another. I do not see an analysis that looks at anything other than the overall global effect, meaning communities still do not get to tell how does this affect my community plus or minus at that sense. So I know in 2017 it was called no cap and trade. There's other modifications to cap and trade that could be considered here. And I'm just have to say I'm a little disturbed to see no attention to this one overall strategy that really affects a serious amount of the emission inventory subject to cap and trade here. So I hope to see more detail on the timeline. I hope these public health workshops, or whatever it's being described as, that we get to learn soon when they're going to come up and that they land at a meaningful part of the process so they can actually seriously meaningfully affect, to use the expression from environmental justice, the outcome of this whole exercise. And thank you for putting on this workshop today. It's been very informative.
Thank you, Richard. Appreciate the comments. I just want to respond to a couple of things here, and then I think maybe Richard's going to jump in as well. So the air quality, the public health analysis, critical part of the scoping plan. It is an important part of how we decide on what is the best path for California for carbon neutrality. And so what I wanted to do is just provide a little clarity here. I think maybe this is a process kind of clarification, which is once we're able to model these alternatives, and once we land on how we're going to design a number of scenarios towards carbon neutrality and get the initial kind of greenhouse gas and energy end use outcomes, UC Irvine will be picking up and doing the emissions analysis, and we will also be doing subsequent public health analysis. All of that information will go back out into the public forum for discussion, for consideration, and ultimately it will go into a decision in front of our board about what is the best pathway for carbon neutrality in consideration of the economic impacts, the public health and emissions impacts, not just greenhouse gases, but traditional air pollutants, and the pathways to carbon neutrality. So that is something that our board will be taking up in a couple of meetings over the course of 2022, and there'll be ample opportunities for folks to bring in their perspectives to that conversation about what is the best path to carbon neutrality in consideration of all of this information, not just greenhouse gases, but economics, emissions from traditional pollutants, and health. So Rajinder, did you want to jump in? Rajinder, I don't know if you're muted, but I cannot hear you.
Thanks for reminding me I was muted. I was just going to add a couple of points onto what you said and then address the purpose of the scoping plan, because there seems to be still some lingering confusion as to what the scoping plan is and what it's meant to drive. So Matt is correct that we have to do the emissions modeling first, and then we have to do the subsequent analyses on the scenarios to show how they differ in the economics, the cost effectiveness, the air quality, the public health, all of those pieces. And all of those are considered in total by the board when they say we actually believe a scenario that looks like this scenario is the right one for California. And that consideration of all of those factors, cost effectiveness, direct emission reductions, public health, air quality, those are in statutes. And I want to make a clarification on AB 197. AB 197 prioritize direct emission reductions. And it also says that we meet the other mandates in AB 32 of minimizing leakage, cost effectiveness, feasibility, etc. So AB 197 itself does not pick one specific factor above all others. It says to include these in that list as you're coming up with a scoping plan and you're putting out alternative scenarios for the board to consider, then ultimately pick as the path for California. But that discussions happens as part of the public process. It happens over the course of the next 15 months as we work through different scenarios, as we look at the different results coming in from public health, air quality, all of those pieces, cost effectiveness, economic jobs, impacts to household incomes. So that is part of the process. That is going to happen. The other piece I want to talk about is the scoping plan. The scoping plan itself does not design or change any existing regulatory programs or statutes in the state. And when we talk about measures like whether it's low carbon fuel standard, because I've heard that being mentioned, I've heard now cap and trade, the scoping plan talks about the outcomes we need to see and the kinds of actions we need to have happen to get there. After the scoping plan is completed, that is when we look at the regulatory tools that we have and whether those need to be adjusted or not to help make sure that we are achieving the outcomes identified in the scoping plan. So we do not model LCFS in the scoping plan. We do not model cap and trade. We do not model advanced clean cars. We don't do that regulatory work in a scoping plan because it is a very high level document that is economy-wide, that is meant to be guidance for how we then subsequently take our regulations and try and achieve those outcomes. And as part of those regulatory actions and those policies that we put in place to achieve those outcomes, we get to have a more detailed and in-depth conversation. What does this mean to communities that have some of these sources that reside next to them or in those communities? So there is a tiering process here that kicks into play after the scoping plan is done. And I want to keep making sure that we come back to the main purpose of the plan, which is not to design or not to change an existing regulatory program or to say we will now have a new program that does XYZ. It can say we need a new program, but it can't actually design or put in place a new program or change an existing program. Thank you.
Next, we have Jim Kennedy. Jim, please unmute yourself to provide your comment. Okay, it looks like Jim has lowered his hand. We have 9 commenters left. Yes, Jim,
Hi.
we can hear you.
Oh, I'm so sorry. I think there was a technical glitch there. I started talking. So my name is Jim Kennedy with the Healthy Air Alliance, and we, of course, support health metrics and health outcomes. And what we have right now is our medical research that shows all emissions reductions does reduce the health burden, but maybe it needs to be focused, of course, on direct sources and overburdened communities. And that has to be kept foremost in mind. I want to acknowledge the EJAC committee's work. But I think Ms. Sahuda might have answered my question with the last bit she said, because I had a question about a workshop on regulatory processes that was started back in 2019. And the question I had was, will CARB's fuel update process be integrated to the 2020 scoping plan update? And of course, now I know that's not going to happen, but I want to make sure that it's kept in mind, those goals or those fuel updates, because it's both on the regulatory side, but it's also on the alternative fuels update. And of course, we support all things that reduce emissions. And that was what the carbon neutrality study in the process was stated in the beginning when the workshops were started back, I think, 2019, that it was going to be an all the above solution, because it has to be about what can be done every day, every single day, to reduce emissions the most possible to get the best health outcome because of the toxic air. And so that is in keeping with AB 617 objectives. But I just want to make sure that, due to the pandemic, a lot of these public workshops were discontinued. Apparently there was multimedia testing done, but there has been no updates given. And so if some of these fuel updates were to proceed, it would help the 2022 scoping plan and meet other goals of SIP, LCFS, the AB 32 goals, and also fulfill some of the recommendations in the CARB, the CARB and the Cal EPA carbon neutrality academic studies, because they had shown that's where the ascent of these alternatives began, I think, if I'm not mistaken, is, these studies were about what were the different mixes of technologies and fuels that could reach us as in different ways to carbon neutrality. And so I think the CARB fuel update is critical to that, and I want to make sure that that's not forgotten. So thank you so much, because again, we are supporting what can be done to increase the pathways that can significantly and measurably and scientifically improve the reduction of air toxins. So, with the feasible alternative fuels and technologies. So thank you for allowing me to acknowledge that the work that CARB has been doing on this issue, and hopefully it can be integrated as the scoping plan moves forward.
Thanks, Jim. This is Rajinder. I think you're talking about the AB 74 studies that were housed in Cal EPA and the first workshops that we did on LCFS in 2019. All of those are being considered and part of the information that we're looking at here. LCFS is a CARB regulation, and to the extent that the scoping plan identifies changes that we need to make sure that we're phasing out fossil fuel combustion, those will have to be reflected back into that program through its own separate regulatory process. But the scoping plan itself cannot change that regulation. So there's still work to do on both of these, but the goal is to align them. Thanks.
We have 9 commenters left. The next 3 will be Ryan Kenny, Griffin Smith, and William Barrett. Ryan, you are up. Let's see, is your hand still raised? All right, Ryan, you're up.
Okay, can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you for your time this morning. Great conversation. I'm Ryan Kenny with Clean Energy. And I wanted to bring up a couple points and we ask staff a couple questions. The carbon neutrality goals that are set, especially in the pathways document, are all long-term, starting in 2035, ending in 2045, and there's a few within the document at 2030. But Julia Levin mentioned earlier about the need to achieve short-lived climate pollutant reductions, especially black carbon, a 50% reduction by 2030. And I was wondering how that would play into the goals here, especially the deadlines that are such a long time from now, and how how diesel won't be the truck of choice in the heavy duty sector with the absence of heavy duty ZEVs not being commercially ready for years to come. There's been some comments about getting rid of combustion engines and biofuels, but I want to make a point that if you look at the LCFS, renewable natural gas is the only fuel that's carbon negative, and it's low carbon and carbon negative. Electricity in the near term, if not intermediate term, doesn't come close to what renewable natural gas can do, especially with the absence of commercially ready heavy duty ZEVs. And I want to make sure that that's considered within the scoping plan and obviously the carbon neutrality goal. I also am wondering from staff if you could comment on whether there will be a commercial readiness analysis on heavy duty ZEVs, because obviously there's a lot of regulations being promulgated right now, but there hasn't been anything publicly released to let the public know what CARB is thinking about as far as commercial readiness of heavy duty ZEVs. What we do have right now is a South Coast AQMD letter that served as basically a quantitative analysis on the readiness of heavy duty ZEVs that was released in August. And that was 9 pages of making the case of why we need both zero and near zero in the near term to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and NOx. So I was wondering from staff, do you plan on releasing such an analysis, and what are your thoughts on that South Coast letter? Finally, I was wondering from staff about omnibus. Obviously, that has not been officially adopted yet by the Office of Administrative Law. obviously there's rumors about what could be happening, and I was wondering how that absence of being adopted informs a scoping plan, because obviously a 0.05 requirement for engines in the heavy duty sector by model year 2024 to 2026, and 0.02 starting in model year 2027. That has not been officially adopted yet. So I wonder if you can address these questions that I have. And thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you. So just a couple of points here that I wanted to make. So again, just kind of pointing back to what we're trying to accomplish here, we are seeking feedback on the alternatives that we're designing for the scoping plan, and for the modeling work that we would be doing. And so those alternatives have varying levels of technology deployment baked into them, and that is information that we've pulled in from the governor's ZEV executive orders in terms of timelines, as well as the governor's directives with respect to achieving carbon neutrality by 2035, as well as other analyses done like the AB 74 studies. When it comes to looking at technology feasibility, and actually before I get there, let me say one other thing too, that in evaluating these scenarios, one of the things that we'll be producing after we produce the kind of the emissions analysis will be the economic analysis, looking at the various cost of deployment of various different technologies, and also the benefits of those deployments from the perspective of health savings and other cost savings. But in terms of technology evaluation and technology readiness, those are kind of step two after the scoping plan. So as we develop the scoping plan recommendations, as the board takes action on the pathway to carbon neutrality, then the agency will start going through the process of looking at its own programs and its own regulations and evaluating what needs to change. And so as part of regulatory development, which is outside of the scoping plan, those programs look at what the pathways are to hit their individual targets, and their ability and the feasibility of that with respect to the pathways to their transportation requirements. So yeah, I think that's it for me.
Yeah, Matt, I will just add that we are going to be kicking off the state implementation strategy. And like I was mentioning earlier, that will go through a lot of the needs for the air quality basis, because you did reference that South Coast AQMD letter. And I think that we will be leveraging a lot of that discussion into the scoping plan for transportation. So would really recommend that folks that want to do the real deep dives on transportation also be engaged on the SIP process here at CARB. Thanks.
Our next commenter is Griffin Smith. Griffin, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, yes, thank you. I had a follow-up clarification question for Jordan on the vehicle fleet electrification. I just wanted to confirm the definition of the zero emission vehicle. As I was taking notes, I wrote battery electric vehicles and fuel cell electric vehicles, and I wanted to clarify that that was the definition of a ZEV.
Hi, Griffin. Yes, that's correct. Plug-in hybrid electric vehicles are also assumed to be ZEVs in some circumstances, unless it's otherwise specified in that table that we provided on the website. Thanks.
Our next commenter will be William Barrett. William, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, this is Will Barrett with the American Lung Association. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can hear you.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Really quickly, I know we're coming up on time. I appreciate the opportunity to comment today and to have another conversation later this month after we have a little bit of a chance to digest all the information coming today. In general, I wanted to start just noting our strong support for rapidly decarbonizing through ramping down on and ending combustion in California across the board as quickly as possible to both protect public health and meet health protective climate standards. We support the efforts that you've kind of laid out to exceed the 2030 targets, and especially through those programs that accelerate zero emission technologies in communities most heavily impacted today by heavy doses of pollution that threatens health and quality of life. We encourage you to keep that focus on 2030 and going beyond that target. The inclusion in, I think it was slide 11, of vehicle retirement in the most aggressive scenario, really think that should be included across the board with however CARB shapes up the final plan, because we think we need both incentive programs to accelerate retirement, but also a strong and clear regulation that's respectful of the SB1 constraints on heavy duty truck retirement. And so as CARB is developing these technology forcing programs that really are critical to saving lives and protecting public health, we need to see that retirement basically set in stone. I have two quick questions and then I'll stop. On slide 16 related to VMT reductions, is it possible to clarify if there is any difference or what the difference would be between alternative 2 and 3 in terms of the targets and dates appear to be the same but contribute to carbon neutrality at different timeframes? So that's on VMT. And then basically just going much earlier to Sasan Sadat's comment about if the more aggressive measures that provide the greatest health benefits, greatest climate benefits, aren't packaged in 2035, we would also very much like to see those packaged at the earliest possible date and not wait for 2045 as the next iteration of those key programs. So thank you very much. I look forward to a response on the VMT question.
Hi, Will. Thank you for that question. Yes, I can confirm that the VMT assumptions in ALT2 and ALT3 are the same. Thanks.
We have 6 commenters left. As a reminder, the workshop will be concluding at noon. The next 3 commenters will be Roger Lynn, Stephen Brink, and Cedric Twite. Roger, you are up. Please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, thank you. Roger Lynn, I'm an attorney with the California Environmental Justice Alliance. First, to share what EJAC members and other environmental justice advocates have conveyed, there are clear transparency concerns and still a question over the meaningful integration of environmental justice into this process. But 3 quick points in addition. First, this is important and I think goes to Ms. Kyle and Mr. Groh's comments. CARB's current methodology misses local impacts. Currently, CARB calculates GHG emissions avoided and then determines the public health benefits of those avoided emissions. But what about the local impacts of greenhouse gas emission reductions? What are the local impacts of the various GHG reduction measures? That's the piece that's missing and that CARB is legally required to consider but has not. AB 32 requires CARB to avoid perpetuating disproportionate impacts. Your current methodology simply does not allow you to meet that mandate. Biofuel serves as an example. Some biofuel proponents have mentioned the life cycle emissions analysis. Yes, but there has to be a consideration of life cycle social costs, public health impacts. Consider how production of biofuels requires expansion of dairies or other land use implications with associated local impacts, such as increased air and water pollution. In addition, CARB and the CEC are long overdue in evaluating these local impacts. You have 1383 pilot projects to do so. How many years ago were those authorized and when did pilots just become projects? The state's violating 1383 by continuing to authorize further projects without consideration of the full social cost implications and fully evaluating the local impacts of those pilots, and I again emphasize pilots. In any event, using biofuels as an example, the current methodology is just blind to these significant impacts. Second, similarly on the theme of unproven and locally damaging technology, CCS, the presentation at the workshop for CCS said it would take a significant amount of time, 8 to 12 some years, to permit and build CCS. So how can CCS be a part of meeting the 2030 target? CARB has focused too much on 2045 and not on 2030. Members of the legislature have also alerted the board to that problem, and it seems that alternatives 2, 3, and 4 also suffer that same flaw. Third, It's important for the assumptions to note which emission reductions are not included in these inputs, but which can be included in the ultimate scenarios, such as ag burning, pesticides production, and mass transit options. To CARB's point on providing data on these emissions, that burden is on the agency, not the public, and it's improper for CARB to shift that significant burden. The public, we, have already informed you of these gaps. Those are additional direct emission reductions that CARB has to prioritize. And to Rajinder's argument on AB 197, the statute says prioritize. So it does pick one factor as the most important direct emission reductions. And the scenario input assumptions should make that clear. Thank you for the time.
Thanks, Roger. This is Rajinder. There was one comment you made that I think we hadn't heard before, and that was related to permitting. I agree. Permitting is going to be a barrier here, and it's going to be a barrier to 2030. And we are seeing across the board, even for the existing 2017 scoping plan and the things called for implementation there, issues emerging. We are seeing local decisions on permitting and local opposition to things like siting of renewables, siting of transmission build out to actually integrate more renewables from the broader grid into regions. And that's important because if we're going to think about taking some gas plants offline or decommissioning them, then we need to make sure that there's reliable access, which means building out transmission and building out more renewables. We also have to think about landfill diversion, and what we're seeing is opposition or delays in permits related to expansion of wastewater facilities or the building of composting facilities. And then in terms of producing renewable fuels, we're seeing issues coming up for permitting and opposition to trying to use our existing assets and use those to develop fuels that can actually provide local air quality benefits and GHG benefits. So I think you just flagged a really big part of achieving that 2030 target, which is if permitting is going to take 8 to 10 years or even 5 to 6 years for something that has been done in the state before, we're in jeopardy of that 2030 target, and that's going to be on the ground execution of the 2017 scoping plan. So I want to make sure that we're clear, not only are we looking at how the progress is being made towards 2030, but we're looking beyond that. But right now we have enough detail and information that we're hearing from other agencies and folks interested in building these new systems to help deal with short-lived climate pollutants or deal with renewable integration, that permitting is coming up as a problem even right now. So setting aside anything on CCS or anything like that, it is an issue today for what we want to try and get done for 2030. Thanks.
Up next, we have Stephen Brink. Stephen, please unmute yourself to provide your comment. Stephen, if you'd like to provide your comment, please unmute yourself. Otherwise, we'll move on to the next commenter. All right, moving on. Next, we have Cedric Twite. Cedric, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Good morning, still. This is Cedric Twite, Sierra Pacific Industries. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great. A few comments and then a question. First, for transparency, the evaluation of using one energy source compared to another needs to be done using a life cycle assessment methodology so that policymakers and the public are not misled regarding the actual emissions of one technology compared to another. Second, the scoping plan needs to acknowledge that forest, drought, and wildfire resiliency projects will be happening at scale, and those projects will be creating a biomass disposal problem that needs to be included in the scoping emissions alternatives, since how those waste streams are handled will impact the state's emissions. The scoping plan needs to analyze and plan for the best disposal pathway for that material. For this analysis, it will be essential for CARB to include the positive externalities associated with those drought and wildfire resiliency projects, including health benefits associated with reducing harmful air pollution, reducing wildfire suppression costs, and improving water quality and quantity. and apply a monetary value to the industries that can improve the emissions profile from disposing of this forest waste. So my question is CARB analyzing these disposal pathways from drought and wildfire resiliency projects? And are these externalities being included? And if not, why?
Hey, Cedric. This is Matt. Thanks for the comments. Just want to flag a couple of things here. And first, that is that as part of the natural working lands modeling that we are embarking on, and as part of the workshop that we held last month, we did mention that we are looking at various management strategies that could be taken on natural working lands and what the effect of those management strategies would be. And one of those outcomes is, the potential to generate biomass and as a result of things like forest management activities. And then the question becomes then, what should that biomass, if anything, be utilized for? And so you'll see the connection here in the workshop that we're conducting today. How do we include biofuels from waste generated biomass into the energy pathways that we've been modeling in the scoping plan? So we are going to, as I mentioned earlier in Julia's comments, have a follow-on workshop to talk about the management strategies for the national working lands sector and what that could mean for emissions in that sector. And that will also be a forum for us to talk about potential biomass generation and end uses in that conversation.
We have 3 commenters left: Evan Edgar, Tom Phillip, and John Constantino. Evan, you are up. Please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hello, my name is Evan Edgar. I'm the engineer for the California Compost Coalition. We are developers of anaerobic digestion facilities throughout California. And of course, we make a lot of good organic compost. I support the previous comments of Todd Campbell, Julia Levine, and Ryan Kennedy. It's so important to focus on the near term now and to get off diesel. And what alternatives are being forced is some of these scenarios that will force our industry, the waste sector, to stay on diesel for another 13 to 18 years until the heavy duty ZEV sector is ready. We are very supportive of the near term 2035 scenarios in which we got to focus on short-lived climate pollutants to bend the climate curve. Very supportive again of methane out of landfills. Landfills are super emitters, and we have goals to get methane reduction 40% by 2030. And a key component of that is getting 75% of the organics out of the landfills by 2025. And that landfill methane, what we can do, we can clean and compress it into a carbon negative in-state RNG fuel. So we can get off the landfills and we can get off diesel. And we're making this RNG where there's a report out by GNA and Associates shows that by 2025, there's going to be over 120 million diesel gallon equivalents of in-state RNG with an average carbon intensity of minus 100. And the waste sector is about a fleet, the refuse sector is about 12,000 to 15,000 fleet out there. And what we have shown is that the waste sector is net zero now with regards to the life cycle analysis of getting organics out of the landfill and recyclables, and then we recycle all the different compost recyclables into the circular economy. What I'm tired of hearing about, I hear a lot about, is that there's not adequate RNG supply and that people are discounting RNG supply, and they're discounting it, whether it be tied to dairies or for very reasons, they're discounting the significance of it. And RNG is very relevant. Our industry has put in over $1 billion into anaerobic digestion and billions more dollars into the CNG platform, the compressed natural gas platform, in order to run our trucks on CNG. And we've been getting off diesel for the last 20 years. CARB told us 20 years ago to get off diesel, and we made big investments in CNG, and it took us about 3 generations of CNG engines to get it right. Right now, we're near zero with NOx. We're carbon negative on fuel. We are the near-term solutions now. So we're very significant. The whole waste sector by 2030 could be off diesel and get off landfills where the and with near zero NOx. It's a very elegant solution that garbage truck that picks up that waste that was destined to the landfill. Instead, it goes to a standalone anaerobic digestion facility, and we put that same truck that picks up that waste can be run on in-state RNG. It's better than Back to the Future Part 2 with that DeLorean and that banana peel. Instead, we're putting that pizza box, we're making RNG and putting that RNG right back into the refuse truck. The battery electric vehicle heavy duty is not ready yet. And if it was ready, it would be on a life cycle analysis that's plus 30. It's not near zero. Near zero vehicles are not zero. It's a farce. The life cycle shows it's plus 30. Well, it's not even carbon neutral now. You have to dig up Africa for all the rare minerals to make all these battery electrics. Put that into the life cycle. So the California Compost Coalition is very supportive of the near-term solutions where we have in-state RNG with near zero trucks. We are getting off diesel. We are getting off landfills. We are very relevant, and the waste sector needs to be recognized for doing the good work we've done to date and the future work we're doing. But we are a carbon negative fuel and net zero greenhouse gases now, and that needs to be part of the scenarios. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment, Evan. We have two more people with their hands raised, and so we're going to continue and to hear from those two people before concluding the workshop.
Tom Phillips, you're up next. Please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for holding this workshop and sharing the scenarios. I'd just like to chime in with some initial reactions to the presentation and start some discussions further down, I hope. I do look forward to seeing how the health impact and cost analysis will be conducted. The E3 model used in the last plan update had some major flaws in terms of health impacts. It did not address indoor exposure, which can dominate the personal or total exposure throughout the day or year. And it's very important for EJ communities as well. I strongly support some of the previous speakers who pointed out that health impacts need to be addressed up front and throughout the whole project. Health needs to be at the table from the beginning. And I would add, for example, that some building designers and researchers are already doing multi-objective optimization rather than just looking at health at the end. They're throwing it all together to holistically address things like carbon, energy, overheating, noise, cost, and jobs. So I think the scenario modeling could try to look at doing this multi-objective modeling as we go. I also agreed that we need to do life cycle analysis because the infrastructure and health impacts will be around for many decades, if not centuries, and we don't want to lock in inefficient buildings or technology for several decades. Regarding health, AB 197 and various other laws and policies require CARB to address health and other social costs, but it's not clear how this plan will seriously address that, especially in terms of indoor and personal exposure factors. Relying on outdoor exposure estimates will mislead our efforts to assess and optimize health benefits from the scoping plan. For example, indoor exposures to heat and combustion pollutants can dominate the health effects that we observe or estimate, especially for vulnerable populations. Also, energy equity or affordable home energy costs, that's another social cost that needs to be addressed. So CARB should use best science and practices to make sure that we have good environmental and building science at the table. It might be beneficial to start with a broad health impact analysis at the beginning to frame these issues, similar to what San Francisco did years ago. A couple more points, if you bear with me. For the building sector, energy efficiency seems to be missing in this plan, especially in existing buildings. We know that's a huge carbon reduction potential, and most major institutions and governments, such as the International Energy Association, Canada, England, the EU, and then also Rocky Mountain Institute and other experts have included energy efficiency in existing and new buildings as a key component for their decarbonization plans. And I just recently found out that not only New York City, but now Washington State are requiring energy and carbon reductions in existing buildings. So California can and should learn from these groups and build on the approaches they've used in these other regions. And then, excuse me, finally, I would say that we need to definitely consider climate change and time value. Speakers have brought up the need to make rapid reductions in carbon emissions, and the scoping plan should include adjustments to also address the rapid increases we're seeing in the average and peak heat over the century, because that will affect our cooling demand and energy costs, as well as grid reliability and health. So for example, we could include resilient cooling measures in our low-income weatherization programs to achieve upfront carbon benefits as well as cost reductions and health benefits. We already have an overheating problem in new and existing buildings, and under the current future climates, it'll be worse. And then we are also seeing a big increase in power outages, which exacerbates this problem. So there's a lot of co-benefits that can be achieved right up front if we should really focus on the time value of these things. And embedded carbon is another example of how to achieve upfront reductions. So finally, I'd just like to encourage CARB and its partners to seriously address health up front and be a world leader in addressing climate change. Thank you very much, and I can submit comments later.
Hi, Tom. This is Stephanie. I just want to thank you for those comments and just acknowledge that we have had some prior conversations with Rocky Mountain Institute, bringing up the indoor exposure comment. It'd be great if you can, I think like you alluded to, take a look at our building decarbonization slides, and then any specific comments you have about those scenario inputs would be very much appreciated.
Our last commenter will be John Constantino. John, please unmute yourself to provide your comment.
Hi, thanks. Appreciate you squeezing me in, and pretty good workshop today. Lots of good discussion. I'll be really quick and focus on the idea that slide 15 talks about facilities closing because there's no combustion alternatives for high heat industries. There is, and Rondo Energy has submitted cost and technology data and will do so again. The state of California should definitely be thinking about decarbonization, but not deindustrialization. The idea that you should close a facility or import more product, whether it be stone, clay, glass, cement, or oil, because you shut down oil production, then you're shipping products across the oceans and all those emissions that are associated with that. So leakage should not be on the table at all. And there are options for decarbonization of hard to decarbonize industrial facilities. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for the time. And the other topics I was going to talk about, including renewable fuels and permitting, have been discussed, and I really appreciate those conversations. Thank you.
All right, John.
Hi, Maureen. We're having trouble hearing you. Hi, Maureen. I'm going to jump in. We're having a little trouble hearing you. I think there's a issue with your mic. So just to close out the workshop here. So this is the schedule we presented at the June kickoff. We are still working toward adoption by the end of the year, the end of next year, sorry, 2022, and a draft scoping plan release in the spring. So until then, there will be many more workshops planned, including the end of October workshop, where we will present revised scenarios and modeling assumptions, and an all-day electricity sector workshop hosted by CARB, CPUC, CEC, and CAISO in November. And we encourage you to continue to stay engaged through the update development process and to submit written comments through October 22nd at the URL on the screen. And you can also find the link on the Scoping Plan Workshops webpage. So thank you for your participation today, and we hope to see you at the next Scoping Plan Workshop and look forward to reading your comment letters. Have a good afternoon.